One of the first things writers will do in any story is make you feel for the main character. This is one of the reasons that agents generally don't like prologues, assuming that the prologue is not based on the main character. And the way writers often try to make you feel for a character is by making them relatable, at least in some way. I often see a lot of comments on certain shows saying that people didn't like it because none of the characters were relatable. And while not all the characters need to be relatable for the viewer to care about them, and a character doesn't need to be wholly relatable, but more a certain aspect of that character needs to be relatable in some way. Ideally, for example, the character Silco in Arcane, acting like a father to Jinx, makes him relatable to us, as most people either grew up with a father figure or are fathers themselves. Another trick writers use is usually to put the main character as the underdog, which I'm sure is relatable to people everywhere, unless somehow you're the best at everything you've ever done. This, along with another technique, is how we are introduced to Vi and Powder. The two of them are walking through a war zone, where a battle is only just ending. We don't know why this has happened, or what they are doing there. What we do see is Powder singing, one hand over her eyes, and another clasped onto Vi's. We can infer from this that Vi has made Powder do this to keep her calm. The eyes to stop her from seeing the bodies, and the singing, something familiar, to keep her from freaking out. This displays her protectiveness of her sibling, a relatable trait. A man who we later find out to be Vander appears to be the sole survivor, though he does not appear happy at what has happened. It's clear that he knows Vi and Powder, and realises why they have come to the battlefield, because he nods towards some corpses of whom are Vi and Powder's parents. Vi breaks down crying, and Powder, the younger of the two sisters, who's likely too young to contemplate what is happening, starts to comfort Vi. Vander looks at his gauntlets for a brief moment before discarding them, perhaps realising the folly of war, and maybe even blaming himself for the battle. He carries Vi and Powder away, perhaps because he knows them, but I believe that it is at least partly because he feels responsible for their parents' deaths. And as he walks away, Vi looks back at the soldier, disappearing back into the fog, and the city of Piltover in anger, something that will justify her actions later. As I mentioned before, here we see these characters at their lowest. And not only that, but we see their motivations and powerful resolves to let us know exactly who these characters are and what they fight for. We can also empathise with them for their relatable traits of protection, responsibility, and sadness. And all of this is done without words. Show, don't tell is a powerful form of storytelling, which is used a lot throughout Arcane. And this opening scene is a perfect example of how to do it well. Really getting us to feel the emotions of these characters, and even making us care for them more by forcing the viewer to think about why all of this has happened, and why they could be feeling this way. We have expended effort on them, and thus we feel attached to them, if only by a little. In this opening shot, one of the first things we see is Vi, and we can instantly tell that years have passed since that opening scene of Arcane. The opening shot of the city indicates a more peaceful time, the climb they just made up indicating that where they live is below, and that they took the scenic route to get to where they are now. Another good example of show don't tell here. We haven't been told what they are doing, but by the fact that they are climbing over rooftops, we can tell that it is something illegal. Remember the justification I mentioned before? Well, did anyone think that they are the bad guys during this section? We're not thinking about who could get hurt from their actions, or what the person who gets robbed will feel like. We're thinking that their actions are justified. This opening scene also doubles as showing us, without telling the situation that they are in, that their living conditions are poor, and in contrast shows us the typical living conditions of someone in Piltover, as this penthouse is one of the only houses we see, and every house we do see in Piltover is very, very high class. Finally, this scene triples as being the inciting incident, the moment in time that something happens that causes everything in the rest of the story to happen. But we will talk about more on that in our analysis of episode 2. Powder finds the hextech crystals and drops one, creating a massive explosion. The alarm sounds and the four run back to the Undercity. We see here that Milo immediately looks to Powder when blaming someone for what happened. This is just the first instance, but sets up for later and introduces the group dynamic of Milo blaming and not getting along with Powder. Vi immediately pulls the group back together, taking neither side but reminding them of what they have just accomplished, setting her as the leader of the group. After leaving Piltover, the difference of the underground streets are immediately apparent. Broken windows and deserted streets. Very likely the place trash is dumped, and a sense of danger we did not have in Piltover. Again, all being shown without a word being said. Clagger interrupts Vi, saying that they don't want trouble. This paints Vi as a bit of a hothead, someone who is hot-tempered and quick to action, whereas Clagger is painted as the thinker of the group. Someone who would rather defuse the situation peacefully than fight. Deckard, a street thug, stops them and asks for a piece of what the group managed to steal from the apartment. Vi getting the first blow emphasises her hot-headedness, but also shows us that this is not the first time she has been in a fight. The brawl itself shows us that even the scrawny Milo can fight. The group obviously being used to it, however this scene emphasises Powder in particular. She is left out of the fight, time slowing to show the brutality of the scene, but also to emphasize Powder's heart rate, the adrenaline pumping through her system and what she is feeling and seeing in that moment. Being younger, she cannot fight like the others, and this is made all the more obvious by the fact that there are 4 thugs and 4 of our main group. Powder is not used to fighting, and thus her family is having to fight harder on her behalf. This knife scene is interesting. We learn some more little tidbits about Deckard in later episodes, which I believe gives extra context to this scene, and hints that the writers have developed even characters like this to be more than just a thug. So I'll revisit this later. Anyway, remember how Milo blamed Powder before? Again showing her inexperience and young age. She chooses to throw away the loot and escape rather than fighting over it. Now we see firsthand why Milo says she jinxes every job. This scene is also the first scene we see Powder fight, or at least tries to. She has a makeshift nail grenade, which she tries to use on the thug, however it doesn't work. This is very simple foreshadowing, which happens a lot and is open, which is often meant to give anticipation to the viewer, as opposed to more hidden foreshadowing that is often used for setting up plot twists. In this case, it is the anticipation that Powder's devices will work in the future, and when that happens, she will become a part of the group. What I really like about this setup is how excellently the writers use this to subvert these expectations, but more about this on episode 3. The lift down is a nice transition, showing us the Undercity. The makeshift bridges and homes built along the side of a crevasse. The colour tone is darker and greener, and there is a noticeable lack of sunlight. Steam wafts from pipes that are jutting out everywhere. Shop stalls line the ground level, the owners brandishing weapons and giving nasty looks. Brothels are located on the main street, showing that in Zaun there is no restraint. Here we are reintroduced to Vander, who is keeping the law, and showing just the kind of power he has in Zaun. Notice how he sits next to Huck, the man with the glasses, and not in the centre of the table, clearly taken aside. This, along with the other members in the bar, all having his back, shows the kind of man he is without it needing to be said. This scene shows Vander as a father figure. We already see him take responsibility in that opening scene of Arcane, but now we get to see exactly the kind of father figure he is. And it's easy to see by how they talk to each other how much he cares for the children and how much they respect him. He tells Vi that fighting will not solve problems, but only make more of them, a lesson we saw him learn, and that the enforcers will come if they become a problem for Piltover. Another scene here building up Powder's mental state. She hears her sister agree with Milo that she can't do what the rest of the group can do. The fact that she leaves before hearing that her sister didn't actually mean what she said. The fact that this happens, that at least a part of her mental state is degrading due to misunderstanding, hints a little bit that we might be looking towards a tragedy happening. Here we are introduced to Benzo, a by-day pawn shop dealer and by-night, I guess, informant. It's not exactly made too clear, but he seems to be an informant for, like, dangerous jobs. And we see how close Vander is to Benzo, which immediately makes us care for Benzo. This is another little trick that we'll talk about in episode 2. We are also introduced to Ekko, aka Little Man, who works for Benzo and appears to be friends with the group. A nice little touch, I thought, is this scene actually goes out of the way to fill in any kind of plot holes that this first episode might have, by informing us that it was Ekko that gave them the tip about the penthouse and how exactly he found the whereabouts of the penthouse to begin with. All of this information is also given very naturally. It's not exactly an info dump, but sometimes when a character delivers information like this, it can come off very unnaturally. Arcane does another excellent job of making it all feel natural. Marcus's role in this scene is important, as it is needed to show us what the general enforcer thinks of the Undercity. His part is quick, but he has already shown us in this instance what Piltover and the rest of the enforcers think of them. This also works in contrast to the enforcer chief Grayson, who is calmer and more familiar with Vander. She shares a different view of the Undercity compared to the rest of the enforcers, which is apparent by the way she interacts with Vander. And if all of this was obvious to you as the viewer when you were watching this episode, it shows just how good the writing was in this episode, that it was able to convey all of this information to you without getting the characters to say any of it. Vi looks out for Powder and shows her that everyone, even Milo and Clagger, and even herself, can make mistakes. She points out her favourite toy that was thrown up out of her reach. And Powder in turn shows Vi the hextech that she still has in her pocket. But the two of them choose to keep it a secret between them. Vi tells Powder that she's stronger than she thinks, and that one day the city will respect them.
One day, this city's gonna respect us.
Here we're introduced to Silco for the first time. A nice little trick the writers do is use Deckard, the thug we met earlier, to introduce Silco, as we learn that Silco was the one who told Deckard to keep a watch over them, immediately creating this connection from the group to Silco. As soon as the information about what the kids did is given, he notes that Vander is in trouble. This immediately forms a link in your mind of when Vander mentions that there are worse things out there, letting us know that these two might very likely know each other and have some kind of history with one another. And that the wound on Silco's face is likely connected to it.
Vander's in trouble.
Someone on our side. Who? There's worse things than enforcers out there.
And again, all of this with only the very smallest of information. We see the experiment he and the Doctor are working on and begin to worry for Vander and the kids. This is a pretty good introduction to a villain of whom we don't know anything about their character. All we know is that they are bad and want to do bad things. But rather than making the villain's motivation about destroying a city that we likely don't care for at this moment, they make his motivation about harming the characters that we do care about. They make his motivation personal. And I think this, in our eyes, makes him a more dangerous and threatening villain, because he is threatening something that we, as the viewer, directly care about. And none of this is explicitly said, but all implied and hinted at through pieces of information given through the story. So here I've made a character map of the first episode, and I wanted to highlight this briefly for the first episode. I will be adding to this character map as we go on, and I wanted to really just point out how the characters are introduced throughout this first episode. And this also kind of applies for how they're introduced throughout the series. We start with Vander, Jinx, and Vi. Or Vander, Powder, and Vi, I should say. Who are our kind of three main characters, who we are the first three characters that we are introduced to. Kind of Milo and Clagger, but mainly Powder, Vi, and Vander. And every character that has been introduced in this episode is related to them in some way, or introduced to us in some way. Benzo is introduced to us via Vander, that we know he is Vander's old friend, and Ekko is an employee for Benzo. Grayson, who is the police chief, is introduced to us through Vander, and Marcus through Grayson. And then finally, Deckard here is introduced to us through his fight with Powder and Vi and the rest of the group, but he links off into Silco, who we know has a mystery connection with Vander at this point, and then the Doctor, who also works for Silco, and we'll see more how this expands throughout the series, and I'll get into more of it in a later episode, but also how the narrative, who we get, the characters we focus on, start off with our main characters and then slowly branch more and more out as we go. But we will see more about that in episode 2. So this has been my analysis on the writing of episode 1. There are a lot of techniques and really smart writing displayed in this episode. If you enjoyed that, I am planning on doing analysis for episode 2, so please subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified when that gets released. This has been That's Effing Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Episode 2 starts with the introduction of Jayce, and the writers very purposefully start his introduction with the scene of Vi and Powder robbing his apartment. Jayce is a prominent character in the story of Arcane, and I think most books would have introduced him in chapter 2, but Arcane chooses to introduce him now. A part of this reason is definitely the fact that this is the start of episode 2, and they want to concentrate the majority of an episode to Jayce. But there is another reason why they do this, and this is also the reason why you see this scene happen first and not the scene of him as a child. Do you remember what I said about writers making you want to care about characters in episode 1? Well, by the end of episode 1, it's safe to say that you care more for Vi and Powder than we did at the beginning. We've seen more of their life and their struggles. We know more about them as people. And that's why Jayce is introduced now. Because we care more for Vi and Powder, we care more about their actions and the consequences of those actions, and who they might have wrongfully hurt. When we're introduced to Jayce, we don't just see a person who got his home robbed. We see the person that has suffered due to Vi and Powder. This instantly creates a connection between him and our main characters, making us instantly care more about him than we would have had he been introduced early on in episode 1, or even in episode 2, but without the robbery scene giving him that connection to Vi and Powder. Also notice in the scene how they introduced Jayce without showing his face and without even telling us his name. I believe this is also meant to allow us to form that connection between him and Vi and Powder before he is revealed to us as a character. And then almost as expected, we see Jayce in his lowest moment, a moment that will define him as a character and allow us to understand who he is and what motivates him. A solid writing technique to make us care for a character. And this is another scene with very little dialogue, like with the first scene of episode 1, allowing us to figure out what is happening just by watching. I think this also draws parallels to Vi and Jinx's opening scene, bigging up the importance of Jayce's character in our minds. We see that he wants to harness magic to save the lives of others, and though this is forbidden, we side with Jayce and agree with his justification because we have seen what he has been through. It's really interesting how these scenes are essentially reversed from the first episode, where we see Vi and Powder's lowest moments first and then the robbery scene. With Jayce, they obviously wanted to make that connection to Vi and Powder first, and it certainly feels a lot more powerful this way. This is a technique I've not used in my writing, but I'm definitely keeping it in mind for the future. Before we go further, I want to talk a bit about the inciting incident. The inciting incident in a story is an event that sets the main character or characters on the journey through the narrative. In other words, the story would not happen without this event. As such, this is an event that sticks in our mind and gives the main character their resolve through their journey. For example, in John Wick, the inciting incident would be John Wick's dog getting killed. If the hero is on a tough journey, this scene can be the resolve for both the hero and the viewers, as it is the most memorable scene in our minds. And in John Wick, if one of the thugs asks for mercy, we instantly think what John Wick is thinking without it even needing to be said.
You killed my dog.
The inciting incident can also indicate what kind of story we're in for and set the tone for the future, John Wick being a darker tone and a story of revenge. The inciting incident in Arcane is the robbery on Jayce's apartment, or more specifically, Powder accidentally dropping the hextech crystal, which blows up half of the apartment. In this case, the inciting incident is effectively telling us that this story is likely going to be one of misfortune and potentially one of tragedy. And the fact that the accident was caused by Powder further strengthens the link in our mind that she is a Jinx, because at any point in this story we can say that this wouldn't have happened if she hadn't have just screwed up here. Had the robbery happened without any issue, Vi and the others would never have been seen. Jayce's apartment would not have been investigated, and the hextech wouldn't have been found. Vi and the others would not have had to have laid low, Vander would not have started to lose power in the underground, and as such, Silco may never have made a move on him at that point. And as Powder would not have had the hextech crystals, she would never have tried to use them, leading to the death of her friends, which would eventually lead to her madness. Arcane has a really great inciting incident because the effects are felt everywhere throughout all the characters and in all parts of the city. And even at the very end of the very last episode of Arcane, the effects of this incident are still front and center. Again, Arcane loves to do multiple things in their scenes. In this scene, showing us what Jayce was doing was illegal, revealing the true consequences of Vi and Powder's actions, and introducing Viktor and setting the seeds that will drive Viktor to action later in the story. I also like that the Enforcer Chief Grayson is here as well, another way of linking events from episode 1 and allowing us to understand why she went to see Vander, again, without telling us directly. Showing Jayce look at the crystal here is purposeful, to show us that he is or will be having a dilemma about his actions. Again, the conversation very quickly making a link between Jayce and Heimerdinger through very natural dialogue. This very quickly lets us form a connection in our mind of who this person is to Jayce, allowing us to emphasize with him more. It's easy to see that this person is like a mentor to Jayce, someone of whom Jayce respects. As well as introducing Heimerdinger, this scene also sets up who he is and his motives through the story, as well as how his ideals will conflict with Jayce's later on. Back to Vi, an intense scene of her practicing her punches, which I believe also re-emphasizes her resolve, clearly annoyed at her own weakness that she's still not strong enough. The scoreboard is all Vi with 2 Clagger on the end. Just a little bit of detail meant to tell us that Clagger can hold his own, but perhaps more so to show how far ahead Vi is compared to Clagger and other kids her age. Clagger mentions that Milo is worried that Powder might beat him again, and here we have extra detail as to why he picks on Powder. She is a better shot than he is. He knows that she is skilled and that likely one day she will replace his space in the group. And now we know that him picking on Powder is likely out of jealousy, frustration, and even a little bit of fear. In my opinion, I don't think the writers needed to go into as much detail, but I'm glad they did, because it adds so much more depth to these characters and their family dynamics. And we see firsthand as Powder whoops Milo's ass at target practice. Outside, Marcus and the other enforcers are looking for Vi and the others, and now we have extra context as to why. It's not just because a building exploded, but because of the hextech cores that was stolen. Knowing this is another hint that bad things are on the horizon, because as far as Vander knows, they only destroyed a bit of property, and he's acting as such, but they actually did something far worse. I also think it's purposeful that Powder goes up to the window in this scene and sees things happening before the man gets flung through the glass. The odds of the enforcers finding them is very low. I mean, they just happen to have an argument outside the building that they're in and then just happen to throw a guy through the glass. But because it's Powder that is seeing this happen, we don't get annoyed that this is some random unlucky event that's happened. We think, well, it happened because Powder's a Jinx. And having us form that connection in our mind without Milo saying it is powerful and very well done. Because had this scene happened without anyone going up to the window, I can imagine a lot of people getting angry and very annoyed with it for being just so random. I mean, imagine they're just doing their thing in the building and then a guy just suddenly gets flung through the glass and the enforcers are there. And again, I have to emphasize just how good the writing is here, in how the writers were able to cross what is effectively a tightrope of a scene and get safely to the other side. Anyway, the enforcers try to search them and they run. Milo's play shots at the enforcers quickly serve to show us how the group are wholly ineffective against them compared to the gang from the day before, with Vi seemingly being the only one capable of doing any damage to them. I think this is the first scene where a character is introduced not through another character. And again, this feels purposeful. We're not supposed to care for Councillor Medarda, or Mel as I'll be calling her in the future, like we are for the other characters, but question her intentions on the council. This is made possible by not being introduced through another, making her connections to the others unknown. Notice how this scene also starts with a zoomed out shot, allowing us to focus on the dialogue so that our first introduction to this character is about her wealth and power as opposed to who she is or what she looks like. This definitely feels less personal than the ways we've been introduced to the other characters. And again, because we're not meant to care for her like we are for the other characters. And as such, this introduction serves better for her purpose within the story. The dialogue at the beginning of the scene quickly tells us of her wealth, power, and motive. This scene and the next are also preparation for the council meeting, allowing us to know at least a few of the council members, mainly the ones that Jayce knows, so that they aren't just a table full of random faces. We start to see tensions rise in the underground, with Vander trying all he can to prevent the same tragedy that happened in the opening scene of episode 1. It's also nice to see that the woman who becomes Silco's bodyguard in the future gets her kind of introduction right here. This scene is interesting with its intentions. On the surface, we see Mel giving a gift to the member of the council, Hoskell, and forgive me if I'm butchering any of these names, so that she can better manipulate the outcome of the votes. However, the connotations are that the council is fallible. We clearly see not every member of the council should really be running a city. This one unable to complete even a child's toy. On one hand, this gives the members of the council a little more personality, but in a way this is saying to us that they are flawed and that the rules they have set in place are not necessarily correct. Rules perhaps pertaining to the arcane. Going back to personality, the council members certainly have it. Shula with the clockwork garment, which clearly showing the level of technology that Piltover has, and perhaps even given hints as to why these people are on the council. Sallow, the ginkgo nut guy that we see, is perhaps dealing in ginkgo nut and other produce, and that's how he made his wealth and made his way onto the council. I also wanted to talk a little about the council meeting itself. There's a lot of work done here to make sure that we as the viewers can understand all of the mechanics at play and the motivations of the other council members, which is impressive for the small amount of screen time dedicated to the setup. I mean, just think about what this vote would have been like if we knew nothing about the other council members. Don't you understand? Magic can change our lives. They could make everyone's lives better.
Nah, you're getting banished.
Why? Why won't you listen to me?
Because I felt like it, okay?
What reason do you have?
Look, why are you talking back to me? Do you know who I am? Good. I don't.
Jayce getting by like he did might feel unearned, or even that he survived just due to a coin toss. The way we actually managed to see the reasoning behind most of the votes was satisfying. We know that Jace and Heimerdinger know each other and that he wants what is best for Jayce. And we know that Caitlyn's mother also wants the same. Mel wants to put Piltover on the map and was likely intrigued by Jace's want for controlling magic. Hence her vote and the manipulation of Hoskell's vote. Then for the votes against Jayce, we can understand Bolbock's vote against him. The reasoning for 5 of the 7 votes are made very clear, and I have to reiterate how very impressive that is with the small amount of time that has been dedicated to these characters. I feel like this act from Jace's mother here is very intentional by the writers. That is, unless she's left-handed. But we can see that 2 of her fingers are prosthetics, which if we go back to the snow scene, we can see that she is frostbitten on those 2 fingers. So as she goes to touch the crystal, these fingers are shown close up, reminding us of what they went through. Something which Jace's mother did not come out of unscathed, and a reminder of that event to which Jayce can see each day. A picture of Jayce with his father hints that his father may have passed away, and here we can see even more the kind of tragedy that Jayce has been through, and his drive to change the world. With all this, we don't need an inner monologue or lengthy dialogue scene to understand what Jayce is going through right now. Just a little touch I love is the posters of magic up on Jace's wall. We're not sure how long ago he moved out of his room, but the fact that they're still up there shows us that he still has that love for magic that he gained as a child when he and his mother were saved. A comparison to note here, in the location of the council standing at the top of the world in a high location in Piltover, whereas Silco resides almost at the bottom of the seafloor, as far down as one can get. This paints him as the council's opposite, an enemy. Silco convinces Deckard to take the shimmer by playing on Deckard's aspirations to be something more than just a thug. And if we look back at the knife scene from episode 1, we can see this in his character, which I love because it really feels like the writers took care and effort even for the minor characters in this show. From what we can gather with the scene with Silco, Deckard appears to want to aim high, and this is why he picked a fight in the first place. Why is Silco interested in these kids? What makes them special? Isn't he better? So after he loses his fight with Vi, he's shown that he isn't special. How can he become someone great if he is beaten here on his own streets? And this defeat is in turn what makes him take the shimmer, his past telling him that he cannot become the great person he wants to be without it. Vi, at least in part, is the greatness that Deckard aspires for, and I believe that he realises this in the moment with the knife. Well, that, and if he does stab her, then Milo and Clagger will probably kill him in retaliation. Here we see Jayce turned away by Mrs. Kiraman, unable to even speak to Caitlyn, who has been his close friend up till this time. And we can see here that he is really hitting rock bottom. He has lost not just his research, but basically everything. I love this still of the council members here. Each of them striking a pose that suits their personality, and each of them standing on a different step, which appears to indicate their level of power on the council. Now that magic has been brought up, the council pushes harder to find the culprits. Marcus moving on Vander is likely due to what Silco told him, else Grayson would be there. And as also Marcus mentions an old friend and stories of Vander's past. Alcohol is associated with time out, recreation and fun. Thus the symbolism of it burning here, and indeed Marcus setting fire to it, is likely that the peace they have enjoyed has now come to an end. And as the scene ends, I think Vander realizes in this moment that things are not going to die down. And we can see the dilemma on his face, the choice that he has to make of going to war with Piltover or sacrificing his kids. Vi wants to fight back, and Vander sees himself in her. He takes her back to where that battle happened in the first scene of episode 1. Faces of the victims are on the walls. Bullet holes and damage from the battle are still present, and Vander tries his best to illustrate the terror of war to Vi, and Vi feels responsible for what is happening, leading to herself giving herself up. Jayce has returned to his old apartment after having lost everything, and fully knows even his research by this point has been destroyed. The scene focuses on a sealed letter and Jayce's bracelet, likely a suicide note. We can understand from what we have seen that this was everything to him. Viktor stops Jayce and saves him, much like how Rise did in the past. And like how Rise gave Jayce the used crystal, Viktor extends his hand with that very same crystal to Jayce. Also, I just want to mention that we're not sure if this character is Rise, but at least for the rest of episode 2, I will be referring to this person as Rise. There is a solemnness to Vi here, needing to prepare herself before she enters, knowing already what she is planning to do, and that this will likely be the last time she sees her family. She concentrates on Powder, who is most important to her, and gives her the toy that she pointed out in the last episode. I think it's clear here that Powder even knows what Vi is planning, or has a bad feeling about it. Her going to the bar with the toy may even have been a cry for help to Vander. It seems like Vi could have gotten the toy down at any time, but she didn't because she didn't need it anymore. It being up there was almost like a reminder of her own failure. However, she knew she would be going to prison, and so she got it down for Powder, so that Powder would have something from her to help her through this transition of not having Vi anymore. And perhaps a symbolic gesture from Vi to Powder, telling her that it's time for her to grow up, just like she had to. And Vander realizes at least a part of this when he picks up the stuffed animal. Here is the character map for episode 2 of Arcane. As you can see, there are a lot more characters that have been added to this since episode 1. One thing I have done is I've added these arrows at the end of each of the lines here to indicate if this character was introduced from another character. So what I mean by this is Jayce was kind of introduced from Jinx, or from Powder and Vi when his apartment was robbed. Rise obviously was saved by, saved Jayce, or who we think is Rise was saved Jayce. So he was introduced from Jayce. Caitlyn was introduced from Jayce. Hummendinger was introduced from Jayce. So we can see here that we've had a lot of characters that have been introduced from Jayce's perspective. And in this first section, we've had a lot of characters that have been introduced, from Vander's perspective or Vi and Powder's perspective. And I did this just kind of illustrate how this map, this web of characters, just expands outwards. I think it'll be interesting to see at the end, to see, what characters get more screen time, what characters we remember more fondly of, and how they were introduced, and how many different webs they have on this diagram. Because we can see that, Jayce has a lot of people linking off from him. Vander, Vi, and Powder have a lot of characters linking off from them as well. And, I think that's really interesting. So getting on to just the more specific changes for episode 2. I haven't bothered adding in the council, despite them being on the image in the background. Mainly because they don't really link to anyone. They're not super important for the story. I guess I could just have like a council up here, but I think Mel is probably good enough. So we have Mel. Mel is really interesting because she isn't introduced through anyone else, and she's just like here. Ignore the blue line is just because the line goes underneath another line. Mel is by herself here, linking off into Jayce, and we'll get more into kind of what, if she links off into anyone in the future. I've also added in Ekko's line here because Jayce was the one who bought parts from Ekko, and then Ekko followed him back into his apartment, and that's what kind of led to everything. But so Ekko does have a link to Jayce here. And then, going from episode 2, we have Rise, who saved Jayce. We have Caitlyn, who is Jayce's friend, and we were introduced to her in that very first apartment scene. And then Caitlyn's mother, who is a part of the council and you know, a patron for Jayce. We have Heimerdinger, who also links off into Viktor, who we got introduced first of all in that apartment scene where the police are questioning Jayce. Jayce has another link to Grace, which is one of the things I really like here, and I did mention this in the video, where we get links from, you know, specifically characters who are more episode 2 into episode 1 here. And we get another link from Silco to Marcus as well. And then I've also added in a line for Sevika. I don't think she's particularly going to link off to anyone other than Silco when she becomes his bodyguard, but I figured just having her here, having her there anyway. What's really interesting about this diagram is we can kind of see that the two paths are separate. The two characters are very separated at the moment. This episode focuses mostly on Jayce, and all of Jayce's characters don't really link into any of the characters down here yet. And we can see a kind of really interesting way they tell this story in that episode 1 focused very much on the Undercity and the characters from the Undercity. Episode 2 does have the characters from the Undercity in, but it focuses mainly on creating links just through characters in Piltover. And whilst also giving a couple of links here and there to old and new characters, so we get these few links between what is essentially the Undercity down here and Piltover up the top. I think that's cool. I think this is going to be really interesting to see as we progress more and more into Arcane, and we get to see more and more of how these links all spread out into one another and how all these characters start to meet at one another and link off with one another, and that's going to be really good. Really looking forward to see what episode 3 has in store. If you like that and you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified for when episode 3 gets released. Also, I just want to give a shout out to Jamie, who helped me with the skit. You can check out his channel in the description below. This has been That Stephen Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In Arcane, there are no heroes and no villains. One of the main points of the series is Powder's descent into madness, to which we have a front row seat. Thematically, this scene fits very well with the rest of Arcane, showing us the duality of things. We see the story from Silco's side, where he is the hero and Vander is the villain. And this shot of Vander's face, darkened out, really emphasizes this. The water scene of Silco feels symbolic for rebirth. We're never told exactly why Vander tries to kill Silco here, which is interesting in of its own point. Instead, the scene focuses on Silco and what he is going through at this moment. It implies that he changed after Vander did this to him, not just from the wound that he has on his face, but mentally as well. He became the person we see him as because of Vander. Episode 3 is going to have a bit of a focus on Silco and his attack on Vander, so placing the scene here at the beginning of the episode lays the groundwork, putting this in our minds, giving justification to the villain for his actions, which is also important for making a good villain. A villain that just wants to destroy for just being evil is boring. But here we at least get to understand the reason for Silco's actions and the reason why he is the way he is. Notice also how the flashback scene is similar to the two for Vi and Powder and Jayce in episodes 1 and 2, putting Silco as a more important character in our minds. However, unlike the first 2 episodes, this scene is not silent. It still exhibits show don't tell, but focuses on Silco at this moment on the precipice of death. Arcane expertly knows what words need to be said and what needs to be show don't tell. And I don't know if this was intentional by the writers. The fact that we aren't told everything about why this is happening almost makes me want to hang off every word said between Silco and Vander in this episode, just to try and figure out what happened. Though this could also be because the backstory either just didn't fit in the episode or needed more time to be told. But I definitely thought about the scene more as a result, and had this scene stick in my head for many episodes to come. I know I've said this many times, but show don't tell is just at its best here. Vi's hands are shaking. Her hands are shaking, showing us that she is afraid, scared of her fate that awaits her. I recently watched the latest episode of Attack on Titan, And there's a scene here of Mikasa leaving her scarf. You don't need to know what... If you haven't watched Attack on Titan, you don't need to know what's going on here, right? But the scarf is significant for her. We know this. Everyone who watches the show know this. This scene did not need another person to be here going, "Hey Mikasa, are you leaving your scarf?" We didn't need that. We just needed to see a silent scene of Mikasa putting the scarf down and just looking at it as though struggling with herself of whether she should take it or not. And that says so much more than having this other character in the scene and going, hey, you know, basically telling us, hey, this scarf, it has relevance to Mikasa and she is leaving it. Now, Attack on Titan does have really good elements of show don't tell, but I had to emphasize this scene in particular because the scarf, of which is the main focus in this scene, is not one of those show don't tell elements. And this is the thing that needed to be show don't tell. And the reason why I just wanted to show this is it's, you know, show don't tell, you might think show don't tell is an easy thing, but it's actually really, really difficult to come by good show don't tell in present day writing for many things. But back to Arcane. This is a sad scene that I feel almost focuses on the consequences of one's actions. Vi is waiting to be taken away, to take responsibility for her actions. Vander is choosing himself to be taken, bearing his responsibilities as a father. Marcus cursing the fact that he made a deal with Silco, the monster created by Vander. This scene feels like the consequences of everyone's actions coming to bear fruit in the worst possible way. They are only where they are because of Vi, only known to Silco because of Marcus, and only even in danger because of what Vander tried to do years prior. The way Silco speaks here is not happy. There is no glee that he has captured Vander, which is a testament, I feel, to the depth of his character. This look in his eyes says so much, in how he feels no satisfaction by what he is doing. The music seemingly reflecting his own heart in this moment. Vander was someone close enough to be his brother at one point. I feel like Silco wants Vander to see what the nation of Zaun could be like. He wants Vander to understand him, to go back to the way things were before. Again, this is just a little bit of speculation on my part, but you can really feel those in-depth emotions just by the look of his expression. My original thought was that Silco and Vander had a falling out over Vander wanting to stop fighting, but Silco wanting to continue. But in the scene, we see a much younger Vander try to kill Silco than the one on the bridge in episode 1. And Silco mentions here that Vander held his respect, even after Vander tried to kill him, but it was only when he decided to make that deal with the enforcers that he lost Silco's respect. We know that they were as close as brothers, and we know they both wanted to make the independent nation of Zaun. But there really isn't enough information to know why Vander betrayed him, at least not yet, not in Season 1. It's been clarified by Amanda Overton that it was only after Vander rescued Vi and Powder on the bridge in that very first scene that he tried to kill Silco. And you can infer this from the fact that Silco sat next to Vander's statue at the end. In other words, this scene is Silco understanding Vander and why he did what he did, meaning that the betrayal would have had to have happened after the bridge scene. And as for why he looks younger, well, this is likely just a mistake or miscommunication, which is unfortunate because Arcane is usually so good when it comes to small details like this. This is another scene on how Arcane loves to do multiple things, and also shows how Arcane spruces up what would otherwise be a tedious scene. Jace and Viktor breaking into Heimerdinger's lab had to happen. We know this, and we had to see it happen, as having a scene where they simply appear in the lab would feel off. However, just having a scene where they break into the lab would be boring, at least in comparison to the rest of the show. And that is why Mel appears here. We need conflict to happen in this scene. Someone unexpected to make the scene interesting, and Arcane says, well, might as well include Mel here and emphasize how cunning she is, and build up her character in our minds. We know that the counselors don't necessarily live in the tower, and at this late in night, you know, she's not exactly doing the duty of the security guard. If you put a little thought into it, I really feel like Mel probably had Jayce watched, knowing that he might try something that if he was worth his salt, if he was worth betting on, then he would try to sneak back in and get his research, and she was going to be there to, you know, try and facilitate that in some way. To probably being informed that he was actually going to the tower, she decided to take that opportunity and give him that chance, knowing what could come of it, knowing that it could help fulfill her dream for putting Piltover on the map. Powder sees Vi's fear here, and it's interesting that Powder appears unafraid for Vander, seemingly only caring if Vi is in trouble and how Vi is feeling. Powder has always been trying to fit in with the family, but here we start to see hints of deeper issues. She's seen at the start of the scene stroking the toy that Vi gave her, and when news comes in about Vander, Powder is focused on Vi. While the others comfort Vi, Powder immediately starts to pack. It's like the only thing on her mind is, how can I be useful? How can I fit in? If I was more useful, then maybe Vi wouldn't have gone away and left me. Vi, however, wants Powder to be safe. This isn't a robbery. This is going against the monster she saw. I love how this conflict is natural and how we can relate to both sides of this. One wanting to protect their sibling and one just wanting to fit in. And even knowing that you're old enough, but not being treated like an adult. Powder has attachment issues. She needs to be attached to someone, and Vi is that person. Out of everyone in the world, Vi gives her comfort and makes her feel safe. And warmth, care and safety is important for anyone's psyche and development, and these characteristics can even be witnessed in animals. And for Powder, it's important for her self-esteem and development that she be able to contribute to the group. Vi has always been sticking up for Powder, but you can tell that Powder has many concerns about what Vi really feels. This is shown in episode 1 where she overhears Vi saying that Milo is right about her, but doesn't hear that it was a joke. All of her fears and concerns are brought to fruition in this one moment where Vi tells her that she is not ready, right to her face. The scene showing a close-up of her expression. Vi puts a hand on her cheek, and Powder understands why she can't go, though the knowledge doesn't help her feeling abandoned and alone. The two touching heads show how much they matter to each other, almost more than sisters, almost like a parent and child. But Powder is left alone in the dark as they leave. What I want to concentrate to begin with in this scene is what Vi says here. Wherever you are, light it up and I'll find you. I promise. We're building up to the climax of Act 1, and this is a major red flag. There is a principle in writing called Chekhov's gun that states that every element in a story must be necessary and irrelevant elements should be removed so as not to appear to make false promises. An example of this would be the gauntlets in Vander's bar, where Vander mentions that he doesn't want to put them on again. We can infer from this that they will be used in the future, or Vander will fight in the future again. The flair Vi gives Powder is the same. It would not be in the story if it is not going to be used. The reason this principle states to remove anything irrelevant is to not make false promises. Imagine if Vi promises Vander that they will meet again, but they never do. It would feel unsatisfying to us viewing the show and leave a bad taste in our mouths. That is why 99% of the time, if a promise is made, i.e. the flair being given to Powder and the promise to us that she will use it, it will happen. But what is more frightening is the context in which it's supposed to be used. Again, wherever you are, light it up and I will find you. I promise. If not for this line, we could believe that Powder might use this later in the episode to show the group where to run if they escape from Silco. But Vi is clearly saying to us that it will be used when they are both separated and don't know where each other are. This is like a promise to us watching that it will be used in this way. And this creates a foreboding that something will go wrong and these two sisters will be separated. Stories never really focus on the mental effects of being left behind, of what it means to be the hero's sidekick, for example, likely due to these being darker themes of showing unexpected consequences and things that would paint the hero in a darker light. But that's what I really like about Arcane, always showing that there are two sides to a story, two sides to an action. Piltover and the Undercity, Vander and Silco, and now Vi and Powder. If we didn't see before, we really start to see how deep the issues are that Powder has. Powder has a panic attack due to her abandonment issues, showing how painful it is for her to be left behind. She is breaking the things that are most precious to her because they aren't good enough, meaning that she wasn't good enough. But when she sees that she can help, the tears stop. I think as well as removing any guilt she might be feeling from what she did. She took the hextech and that has caused a bunch of trouble for the Undercity and even Vi to almost be taken away. But if she can use that very same hextech to save them from Silco, a seemingly unrelated threat to her at this moment, then her actions can be validated as well as her use to her sister and her family. I like how Jayce is remembering what his saviour did when he was a kid. It explains why he is able to create this technology and no one else is, especially those older and wiser than him. Just like how Ekko tells Clagger how he got the tip about Jayce's apartment, Arcane goes the extra mile on closing any kind of plot holes in the story. This scene has also been put here purposefully. One being the climax of Jayce's story in Act 1, which is the lesser of the two main stories, Vi and Powder's being the greater. And 2, to show and emphasize the power of the hextech crystals, or perhaps more specifically, not just to show what they are capable of, but how hard they are to control. Jayce was only able to control it because he had seen this person cast some spell as a child, and because of years of research. As the scene turns to Powder, it focuses right away on the crystals as Powder is trying to make them work in her toy. And we know that Powder cannot control them. She doesn't know what she is doing. She doesn't have the years of research nor the first-hand knowledge of any spell. All of the emotions we had from the high of the last scene instantly turn to dread, like the flip of a coin. Again, like two sides are being shown. Powder touches heads with her toy, which parallels the way she and Vi touched heads earlier. She wants to prove to herself that she can contribute. And herein lies the perfect tragedy of this story. What almost everything has been building up to, from the accident of blowing up Jayce's apartment, to the miscommunications, to seeing her devices failing, to constantly being called a jinx. Vi beats Silco's goons and manages to hold back Monster Deckard. Milo managed to get Vander out of his cuffs, and Clagger has secured an escape route for them. Every one of them working together has managed to pull off a miracle. But then Powder, the one who wants so much to be accepted, tries to help with only the best of intentions. I mentioned in episode 1 how the writers excellently defy our expectations. We see Powder's devices not working in episode 1. This is another promise made to the audience, that one day they will work. And with no knowledge of what is going to happen, we assume that one day, when that happens, Powder will be accepted into the group. So when this scene is first delivered, we believe that this is that moment. This is the time her device will work, and with it, she will save her family. It's an easy future to see, and with Powder falling in this scene, she feels like she's finally been accepted. But in the moment that her device works, it does not save her family, but kills them. Risking your life for another is not something just anyone does, even if you're on Silco's payroll. This act of Sevika pushing Silco out the way adds a ton to her character, that she was willing to do this. And again, this is another attention to detail that Arcane loves to do so much. Like Ekko tailing Jayce before, it answers any questions that we might have had. Showing her in the bar arguing with Vander tells us that she is not happy with the situation, and this is enough context to understand here that she must want what Silco wants. And to that end, she is willing to lose her life to obtain it. Vander fighting here is fulfilling the promise that we saw earlier when he points to the gauntlets and tells Marcus that he doesn't want to have to take them down. The two fighting one another again, the memories of that day likely flashing back for the both of them. We see how Silco cuts Vander on the arm, the same arm he brushes when he says there are worse things out there in episode 1. We don't need words to know how hard this is for both of them. We even see Vander's head pressed against Silco's, much like how Vi did for Powder, symbolising how the two of them were as close as the sisters at one point. And in the scene, it's almost like Vander is fighting with himself. He regrets the betrayal. What he's currently doing is something the old, violent Vander would do. He wanted so much to resolve things peacefully, but in the end he had to resort to violence. He had to let the old Vander out. Powder wants affirmation from Vi, so she proudly runs to her, telling her that her bomb worked. However, she sees that the worst has happened, and she will have to live with this guilt. Vi has just lived through the death of 3 of her family members, and due to her upset emotions, she is not really thinking, and thus just reacts most naturally for her, which is violence. But what hurts Powder the most is the abandonment, and Vi confirming that she is a jinx. Vi seeing the blood on her hands, she realises that she needs to calm down before she makes anything worse, and walks away to do so. But Powder sees this as her sister abandoning her. Silco caused all of this, but Powder is under so much emotional distress at the moment that she needs affection from anyone, even if that person is the bad guy. Marcus's dialogue in this scene is a little off to me. He knocks out Vi and says he'll kill you if he hears you. Come on, let's go. I've pointed out so many good points about Arcane, I have to also point out some minor negatives. To me, this just feels weird. The dialogue is though he wants to help Vi and that he's on her side, but he's already knocking her out. And we know from later that he very likely uses Vi to get his promotion to Enforcer Chief. This act is done either on his own desire for promotion or to make the deaths of the other enforcers not for nothing, or both potentially, which is why the dialogue is off. And considering Arcane's attention to detail, it feels off. I mean, in the scene after the battle, we can see him moping on the bridge. His mask is discarded and his hat is not on his head, symbolizing that at this point he's not an enforcer in his own eyes. But in the scene with Vi, he's wearing it again, and I feel like this is intentional, telling us that in that time from the explosion that he saw to when he finds Vi, he's kind of straightened himself out and remembers why he's there, what he needs to do, what his duty is. I feel like this is a scene that may have been rewritten at the last moment. Perhaps initially Vi spots Marcus and he uses those lines to gain her trust and get close enough to her to knock her out. But at the last moment they decided a quicker scene would be a better fit. I do like how all the pieces are used, however. Marcus still being in the Undercity and coming into play in this final moment is like the perfect twisted end to this tragedy. Amanda Overton has clarified that Marcus returned here because he felt guilty for his dealings with Silco and wanted to make amends, and that he knocks out Vi as she would have died if she had tried to go for Silco. But I don't believe he did this for Vi's benefit. Marcus is a great character because of his complexity and how he struggles throughout the series with doing the right thing. Going forward a bit, we're told that Vi is put in Stillwater without charges or sentence and her paperwork is shuffled away. Marcus also tells Silco that she is dead. It is possible that he deluded himself into thinking that he was doing the right thing, that by putting her in there he was protecting her, but as he didn't know her, nor have any idea about when he would be able to release her, I think it's more likely that he wanted to use her to testify against Silco when the time came. But he could never bring himself to do this, as it would also reveal the fact that he had made a deal with Silco. And finally, Silco. He sees the parallels in Powder and her sister to himself and Vander, and in that moment he relates to her and understands her. He sees himself in her and knows exactly what to say in that moment. And you can see the look of anger from Powder here, almost like she's saying, I'm going to prove to you that I'm good enough and strong enough, and that you shouldn't have abandoned me. I feel like Act 1 is probably the strongest act in the show. It's focused on what it needs to be focused on, with little extra fluff, and has a proper beginning, middle, and end. Jayce's section is incorporated in just the right amount, and in just the right way. Jayce is wholly unimportant to the events of the Undercity in Act 1, except for the hextech crystal. They could have had Act 1 without him, but that would have been a detriment to the story, because having him shows us the other side of that coin. The goings-on of Piltover and how it is run, but most importantly, setting up for Act 2. One of the greatest things in stories is experiencing how characters change. What they were like at point A to what they have become at point B. Vi was headstrong and gun-ho at the start, but now feels like the oldest out of her group, maturing and wising up enough to take responsibility for her own actions. And Powder, the most tragic of all, wants to prove herself worthy, but now in a very different way, scarred from the experiences she has gone through. Jayce is more of a sub-story, but still goes through a crisis of his faith in himself and his own research, only for it to be reignited by Viktor. And this is just Act 1. Their stories are not finished and their journey to point B not yet over. But even just partway through, we can see how they are already changing as people. One of the other really important things I love about Arcane Act 1 is that every scene is packed full of information, both told and untold, making you want to concentrate fully on the show so that you don't miss any detail. Arcane Act 1 is really excellent in how complete of a story it feels, whilst also setting up for the future. So this is the character map for episode 3. Now, one thing you'll probably notice is that it hasn't expanded that much from episode 2. There's been no new character introductions, and that's how it should be. Generally, Act 1 is kind of a complete story, and we're not really going to see many new characters or links created after that kind of 2/3 mark, because in general, a new character being introduced, towards the end of the story it's kind of unsatisfying, kind of weird that kind of unsatisfying, especially if they have like a bigger role to play in the story. So all of the character introductions and setup, especially those who have bigger roles in the story, need to be done earlier on in the story. And that's why we don't really see any new character introductions in this in this episode. I've added a skull and crossbone for all of the characters that have died in this episode. We've had a lot of deaths. We've had a lot of deaths in this episode. I think probably the most named deaths out of any episode of Arcane. I've put the lines going from Silco to Grayson and Benzo as killed rather than from Deckard because Silco, even though Deckard was the one who killed them, Silco was the one responsible for it. He was the one who gave the order to kill them. And Silco was also kind of responsible for Vander's death as well. Whereas Vander was the one who kills Monster Deckard, and Powder is the one who is mostly responsible for killing her family, Milo and Clagger. There's also a few new links on here. Mainly Vi and Powder, their status kind of changed into abandoned now, because Powder feels that Vi abandoned her. There's also now a link between Powder and Silco, which I've kind of put as a question mark because we don't truly really find out what this means in this episode. But we do find out that, you know, Silco almost becomes like a foster father for Powder in the future. I neglected to put a link between Powder and Singe because even though Singe does get caught up in this explosion, there doesn't seem to really be kind of any ramifications from it in the future other than him working not obviously in the same lab. And I have a link between Powder and Sevika. Because of Powder's explosion, Sevika loses her arm and we see her get that robot arm kind of in the future. I think there is also more to this than her just getting the robot arm, but that will be discussed in the later episodes when we kind of start to see their relationship with one another. Apart from that, there hasn't really been any new changes up here other than Viktor becoming Jayce's partner. Again, this episode mainly focuses on the Undercity and has a much, less of a focus on the on Piltover. And obviously in this episode, Sevika becomes the bodyguard for Silco. So there are, it definitely looks like there are more linking off in this episode from events that have happened in this episode. But as per usual, no real new characters being introduced in these episodes because this is like the end of Act 1, the end of a story in a way. And that's been my analysis for Act 1 of Arcane. Thank you very, very much for watching, especially if you've gotten to this point. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and want to know when episode 4 is going to be coming out. This has been That's Effing Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. What is Progress Day exactly? I did some research to check out exactly what Progress Day is, but the show doesn't feel the need to tell you what it is here at the start at episode 4 where it is most relevant, and I think this shows amazing restraint by the writers. Even without knowing what it is, we know that the word progress means to advance, so we can determine that this is some sort of holiday where the advancement of technology and Piltover's prosperity because of said advancements is being celebrated. Instead, the scene focuses on Jayce and Heimerdinger, focusing on their conversation about Stanwyck per Diddley. All Stanwyck ever built exploded or didn't work, but he realised that the future of the city was about everyone working together and made the sacrifice of personal ambition. This is an important piece of information for Jayce, something that will affect his actions in this episode, and this is why I don't think they explained what Progress Day actually is. Had they done so, I believe most people would have taken that bit of information away from this scene, and not the information about Stanwyck. However, the writers still need to show that it is Progress Day and that it is a celebrated day. They also need to show the advancement of Piltover since Act 1, and as such, they were able to draw a fine line, choosing to reveal the wonders of Piltover more as a shot placing the characters than the focus of the scene. Which, notice how this scene is also in a dark room, so as not to distract the viewers with any new advancements while the information is being said. We learn about Progress Day and Stanwyck, and the two feel separated, which again shows the fine line the writers had to walk and the restraint they had when making this scene. The other thing I wanted to highlight in this scene here was that they start episode 4 in Piltover, which ended very differently than the Undercity in Act 1. There is a high from Jayce's success, compared to the Undercity of which we don't know what will happen now that Vander, the person who was holding it all together, is now dead. This is done to build anticipation. We want to know what has happened to the Undercity, and we want to know what has happened to Vi and Powder, and as such, these elements are held back from us to keep us eagerly watching to find out what's happened to them. Caitlyn was not an important character in Act 1. I think she was certainly memorable, but I could definitely understand if anyone didn't remember her. In Act 2 and 3, she goes from being a side character to one of the main characters, and as is usual in Arcane by now, the show uses the technique of introducing, or rather, in this case, reintroducing her through another character, this being Jayce. We're first of all treated to a scene of Jayce and the Kiramans, showing us their repaired relationship, but also loading them into our minds for Caitlyn's introduction. All of the links Caitlyn had in Act 1 are shown to us first. Her parents and her friend, before she is reintroduced, reminding us of her actions in Act 1 and giving us a good sense of where she is placed in this story and in this world. The scene also shows us, again, through natural dialogue, the relationship between her and her parents, and tying this to the career path she has chosen. I think the fact that Progress Day itself is a holiday of sorts is foreshadowing for the fact that something is probably going to go wrong. What's great about this scene is that we still don't know exactly what has happened to the Underground, and purposefully, rather than showing us a scene in the Underground directly, the writers give us hints and bits of information first. We want to know what has happened, as the Underground was the majority of where Act 1 took place, and the writers know this. This makes scenes more interesting to watch as we are trying to glean any piece of information we can to find out what might have happened to Vi or even to Powder. And as such, we start to learn here that Silco's reach has spread further, as he is now shipping Shimmer to either Piltover or other locations via the Hex Gates, or both. And also that the Underground is no longer united, with this new gang, the Firelights, attacking Silco's crew. I also didn't notice this in my first watch, but the Firelights don't kill anyone. In fact, they go to great lengths to make sure all their weapons are non-lethal, something which is important for when you find out who the Firelights leader is. Being able to satisfy the reader or the viewer is perhaps one of the most important things in writing. If you can satisfy your audience, then you can get away with almost anything. But on the other end of the stick, you also have to worry about something being unsatisfying. This is one of the things that can happen when making false promises. For example, if there is a secret about a box, and we learn lots of little bits of information about that box, we're naturally going to assume in the story that that box will be opened at some point. And because of that, we anticipate it. We anticipate what we're going to find in that box. But if the story ends and that box is never opened, it's unsatisfying. An example in Arcane would be the flare in episode 3. We know this is a promise that Powder is going to use that flare at some point. Well, a smaller hidden promise is made in this scene, and this is the promise we're going to discover at least some sort of information about Powder. The writers purposely show us the scene before showing us Powder, Vi, Silco, or anything in the Underground, basically dangling a carrot in front of us in order to build up our anticipation. And oh, isn't this a far more exhilarating scene because of it? If the drawing on the ceiling didn't confirm it, the "she's here" from the man does. But this is said along with fear that you can hear from the men. And along with their actions, build up in our minds what Powder could be like now. And in fact, the foreshadowing in Act 1 also helps build up Powder in our minds for this moment. We've always assumed that her toys will work one day. I think the monkey toy at the end of Act 1 is supposed to symbolise that Powder has reached a level where her toys now work. And we already know she's a great shot. We've known that someday she will become someone that can stand side by side with Vi. And the words and actions of these men confirm this, but in a darker way. We knew the dangerous part, but now we know she's become someone who is feared. And Arcane builds up this image of Powder in our minds before she is revealed, all of it coming together with the swing, a reminder of the innocence Powder once held, the child she was, contradicted with the boom here, symbolising Silco's corruption of her. And finally the reveal. Longer hair to show that she is now an adult. Still young, but an adult within the realms of responsibility and the story. Her attire is very different from Act 1, emphasising the rebellious nature of Silco and the gang she is now in. And white skin, which emphasises the colour palette on display and the new tattoos down one side. We can still see the child Powder here, but we can also see just how much she's changed. And I should mention that, spoiler, the Firelight's leader is Ekko. Him being masked in the scene is important. I don't think the writers had him masked and his voice changed just so they could make a shocking reveal later on in the story. They had him masked here because it would have hurt Powder's reveal and the eventual showdown between Powder and Ekko on the bridge. Had he been revealed here, our attention would have been taken off the underground and the bits of information the show is trying to tell us and put onto Ekko. He would have been considered the focus of the scene. And remember what I said about something being unsatisfying? Well, we wouldn't have found out anything about him other than him being the leader of this gang. The focus of the scene would have been on one thing, while the scene tries to do another, almost like telling us to look to the left, while all the interesting things are happening to the right. And when he sees Powder, we would expect something like the scene on the bridge to happen between the two, which would be less satisfying without the build-up or stakes or anything that we were treated to in that scene. Powder is almost like an unstoppable force in this scene, really highlighting how she is now on par with Vi, and this is important. Her being a League hero notwithstanding, we need to know how strong she is compared to the other rank and file characters, so that her actions later in the series are not stretches of the imagination. Basically, if Arcane can convince us that Powder can do something, then she can. And Powder is only stopped when she's reminded of Vi. Again, the music from the scene emphasising her messed up emotions. This also showing us how messed up she has become from her experiences in Act 1. In Episode 2 we learn a lot about Heimerdinger, and how old he is and how weary of magic he is. I like the themes that come up here and the conflict that starts in this scene that soon spirals out into the rest of the series. Heimerdinger is 307 years old, and will likely outlive Jace and Viktor. He doesn't understand what 10 years means for a human, but he also has some good points that going too fast can be bad, and especially the point on safeguarding the hextech so it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But I think a lot of these valid points are shrouded by not understanding what a human's limited lifespan means to them. I think as this scene plays out, we can feel the disappointment along with Jace and Viktor because we want them to do well and we want the technology to advance even more. And Heimerdinger doesn't even seem to realise that he has invited this conflict, as he is simply doing what he feels is best. I've seen so many shows where conflict just feels forced, and when it feels forced, it really takes you out of the experience. It takes you out of the show, because you start questioning the show and would these characters really do that, for example? But in Arcane, it just feels natural, taking into account all of these characters' past and experiences in order to create this conflict. Imagine if this scene with Caitlyn had been the first scene with her in Atoll. I think this highlights how good Arcane is at introducing characters. If Caitlyn hadn't been introduced via Jayce, I can imagine another show giving Caitlyn her own scene before this. Perhaps one where she is getting ready for work and has a fight with her parents about her job. The scene would have been longer than the one she was actually introduced in, and wouldn't have shown her relationship with Jayce. This scene also reintroduces Marcus as sheriff, now having been promoted and seemingly still in Silco's pocket. But it's great how the show doesn't outright tell us this. We can determine it by how no one seemed to be allowed on the ship, and how he sent the thug straight to prison without even interrogating him like Caitlyn was trying to do. And now we have been given all the little bits of information about the underground. Arcane is finally ready to show us its first scene located there, finally revealing what the underground has become under Silco's influence. More lawless, but seemingly also more prosperous and lively. Sevika here is not so kind to Powder, which we saw in an earlier scene, but her reaction to Powder is not to be unexpected, considering how Powder was responsible for her losing her arm in Act 1. And again, subtle dialogue here from Silco.
Who's we?
Who's we? Without it being said, it's easy to feel protective nature coming from him in this scene. And straight after, we see firsthand the relationship between Powder and Silco. He asks her what happened, wanting to hear it from her, meaning he trusts her and has faith in her. And Powder casually hanging out in the rafters of his office shows how close to him she is. Something stronger than just boss and subordinate, almost something more like family. Silco even hands her the object he uses to inject shimmer into his eye, putting himself in a vulnerable state while Powder uses it on him. And Powder even rests her head on his, kind of like how Vi did with Powder before. The main objective of this scene was to show the relationship between these two, and Arcane definitely nailed it there. And another big thing to add with this Silco and Jinx scene is that Silco completely excuses her behaviour, hand-waving the fact that she destroyed valuable property and almost killed some of his men. And this enables Jinx's destructive habits and impulses because there are no boundaries or rules being set here. The scene shows us how close the two are, but also how imperfect their relationship is. Silco, as we will see in the future, thinks that what is best for Jinx is what was best for him, as they both suffered betrayals in the past. But Jinx has more issues than this, and Silco appears either blind to them or unable to help with them. And this is shown clearly by how Jinx is sent to her room alone, which in turn triggers her obsessive fear of abandonment because she feels she isn't useful. I mentioned in episode 2 that Mel was purposefully introduced without any links to anyone. And again, in this scene we are reintroduced to her before Jayce, not through Jayce. We know she wants to put Piltover on the map, which she has done, but why exactly, and to what ends is she willing to make her ambitions happen? That's what makes these scenes all the more interesting with Jayce. She's trying to manipulate him, but to what end? And will that end be beneficial to Jayce or just her? I want to go back a little bit and mention how Powder, or rather Jinx, is introduced, and how that can be important and set the tone for a character going forward in the story. Jinx was introduced as being dangerous and strong, but at the same time being a loose cannon. She loses control in her first fight, which does a number of things. One, making us care for her, as we can still see Powder within her, that she is not this evil person, but scared and afraid due to her past experiences. And second is akin to showing us that she is a ticking time bomb. She's strong enough that she was able to fight off the Firelights by herself. However, this strength is unreliable, something that is likely to cause chaos when it goes off, and almost saying to us that it will happen again because you don't introduce an element to a story that you aren't going to use again. But I wanted to bring this up now because this is the first time we start to see the mental issues that Jinx is facing, and in this scene we see stuffed dolls of Milo and Clagger, who used to be her family, and we see her hearing their voices in her head. Now, it's still a little too early to say really too much about this, but what I can say from this scene is you notice that Milo's voice is clearly more negative, Milo being the person who berated her in her past, and whenever she is shouting back, it's always due to something Milo has said, whereas Clagger seems to be a more positive reinforcement voice. Very likely these voices taking on the roles that Milo and Clagger kind of used to take when they were alive and they were a family and all together. Powder is worried that Silco will abandon her because she failed. Her annoyance with Seeker from earlier appears to be less about rivalry and more about making sure that she is the most useful one to Silco, so that she'll never be abandoned again. And to that end, she's willing to do something big. She knows that Silco has a problem on his hands, and she wants to be the one to offer him up the solution. Jayce is conflicted here. Heimerdinger has been his mentor and has looked out for him for years. And Jayce wants to take Heimerdinger's advice seriously. He believes that the Hex gemstones are ready, but he's also young and doesn't have the wisdom and experience that Heimerdinger has. And in the void that Jayce's father left, it's not unlikely that Jayce looks towards Heimerdinger almost like a father. Viktor and Mel believe the gemstones are ready, and they believe Piltover needs to look forwards, and Jayce shares this belief, but it's hard to say no to a father's wishes, especially a father you look up to. As Jayce found Mel at the party, it's not unlikely to believe that she has influence on him, like Heimerdinger does, and these two influences are pulling at Jayce from separate sides. And thus far we can tell that Mel's influence is weaker than Heimerdinger's. But like the scenes in episode 1 with Powder's toys, this is a form of foreshadowing for a moment in the future where Jayce will need to choose between Mel and Heimerdinger. In the very first scene, Stanwyck Padiddley is brought up, mentioning that he was not remembered for his inventions, but sacrificing his personal ambitions to try and make everyone work together. The conversation with Heimerdinger had an effect on Jayce, and like with the speech we can see it clearly here, where he is trying to do the same thing, and this clearly has a large effect on Heimerdinger. And going to Mel, I could definitely imagine this scene from Mel's perspective. Knowing what we know about her by the end of the season, you can see her scheming. Jayce's vow is not one that she wanted to hear. If this were a battle between her and Heimerdinger over who could win Jayce, then it would seem like Heimerdinger's victory. But somehow she pulls everything back, calculatingly using Jayce's vow to pull in Heimerdinger and get him to vote on her plan. Caitlyn wants to make something of herself without needing to use her parents' power. I love how intricately woven all these characters are to each other. Caitlyn, who was Jayce's friend when she was a child, saw firsthand how he made himself up to be something from basically nothing. And it's very possible that her decision to go against her parents' wishes and become an enforcer was influenced by this. Without Jayce, she might have taken a completely different path, which speaks loads about how much she respects him in her mind, and also hurts just as much when she calls him Counselor rather than his actual name. And finally, just a brief bit on the end here. Vi's introduction here is not really an introduction, more of something to keep us watching for the next episode. But this is the last thing we've been waiting for since the start of the episode, to know what happened to Vi and where she is. Going back to when I spoke about satisfaction, her being revealed here is also fulfilling a promise that was made to us, that we will find out what has happened to her. So this is a character map for episode 4. I've added all the new bits in red, but as this is becoming ever more complicated with each episode going on, I decided to make a new character map using just what happens in this episode to make things a bit more easier to see. In this new character map, we can see that Jayce's stuff is largely unchanged. In fact, Jayce is definitely the main character here that you can kind of tell by all the arrows that are going off by him. All these characters were introduced from Jayce's perspective, which is by far the most out of any character in this episode. Some other interesting things to glean from here. Mel again is not introduced by any character, putting her just by herself, which again I mentioned was for reasons of keeping her motives hidden, so that we question about her place within this world in this story and what she could be plotting and everything. As well as Mel, in this episode, Jinx is introduced via the Firelights, which puts her as more of an antagonist in this episode, which we do know. And Jinx, there are a lot of links coming off Jinx. She is kind of the second main character of the episode. And most importantly, she has the main link going up into Jayce, where she steals the gemstone. She's like the main connector into Piltover, the person who is creating all the conflict that's happening in this story. Well, not all the conflict, there is still Silco, but sparking off all the conflict, basically. And we can see here that Jinx steals the gemstone from Jayce. She almost kills Caitlyn, and Silco is now like a father figure to her, whereas Silco just has his agreement with Marcus. I thought it was apt to do a new character map here, since this is the start of Act 2, which would kind of be like Book 2, but more importantly because there has been a time skip in the story. But despite there being a time skip, we were still introduced to a lot of characters, so it's interesting to see like how Arcane decided to reintroduce these characters. Again, mainly using Jayce to reintroduce these characters, whereas the Undercity, of which the characters did have less of a focus in this episode, they weren't really all introduced by anyone in particular down there. The Firelights introduced Jinx, and Sevika kind of introduced us to Silco in that scene. But apart from that, there was not too many characters actually in the Undercity in this episode. Well, that's been my analysis of episode 4. I always seem to have a lot more to say about the start of a story, where things are being set up, where it's interesting how scenes are portrayed to us, how characters are introduced to us, and where all the dominoes are set up in the story for them to eventually all be knocked over. I hope you enjoyed that. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. This has been That's for Rich, and I will see you in the next one. What are you shooting for? This is what Grayson asked Caitlyn after the competition that they have in Caitlyn's flashback. Grayson does it to protect the people and be of service to the city. But why does Caitlyn do it? In the first scene of the episode, we see a flashback of Caitlyn and Grayson in a competition. This flashback scene is not silent, and is not Caitlyn's lowest point, but it is a point in her life that means something to her. I think this hints a little more as to why she became an enforcer here. It's very likely that Grayson's death triggered Caitlyn in some way to want to become an enforcer, perhaps to find out who killed her and get revenge. And though this scene is not silent, like Vi, Powder and Jayce's, it puts emphasis on Caitlyn and asks the question why she trains with the gun. One which we as the audience want to listen and look for the answer. I think this also denotes the point in which she becomes one of the main characters of the show. The scene does not need to make us emphasise with Caitlyn, unlike the others for Jayce and Vi and Powder. The show has already done that by showing us her relationship with Jayce, and her being the one who found Vi for us. It still wants the scene to put emphasis on her, to almost elevate her in our minds to status of main character, but does not need to show us her lowest point. In the last episode, we found out that she became an enforcer and had a disagreement with her parents. She also appears to have an obsession with finding out who this crime boss is in the Undercity. And this scene gives us hints towards that, but more importantly, a look at who Caitlyn is as a character. Again, what are you shooting for? This scene may not show us her at her lowest point, but like with the others, it shows us the scene that defines her as a character. Vi expects to be beaten here. You can tell from the dialogue here that this is her world and she has accepted it. She expects the world to come at her and doesn't trust it. She doesn't trust anyone, and she doesn't feel safe anywhere. And in particular in this scene, she does not trust Caitlyn. Caitlyn as well can't trust Vi at this moment. We know she can't because they haven't had enough time together, they barely know each other, and Vi, for all she knows, is a criminal. However, we were just given the reason, or at least the hint to the reason for why she releases Vi. An obsession with catching Silco, or perhaps wanting so badly to prove that she isn't just a councillor's daughter. Enough of one that she'll take the risk of trusting someone she doesn't even know. She even walks over the red line in this scene and doesn't back down as Vi runs up to the bars, really showing just how much she wants this, how much she is willing to risk to get what she wants here. Marcus is such a complex yet realistic character. I'll speak about him more later in the episode, but we can see here how conflicted he feels. Just having given the sermon for the dead enforcers, of which he feels responsible, not just for being the enforcer chief, but for being in Silco's pocket. He clearly respected Grayson, the responsibility of her death weighing on him, and by the expression on his face here, he doesn't feel like he lives up to her memory. Grayson asks Caitlyn in the flashback what she is shooting for, and I feel like what Marcus is shooting for is holding onto his hand right here. Another thing I love here is the placement of this scene within the story. Grayson was a relatively minor character, and yet there are so many events happening due to her death. Powder may be the main cause of the issues in Arcane, but Silco's influence on the events in Piltover and the Undercity are not minor. Jinx appears to hesitate before activating the device here. The scene going to Milo, which, as we discussed in the last episode, is negative reinforcement in her mind. The last time that we know of that she used these crystals, she ended up killing her family. I could easily understand her not wanting to even attempt this, and I'm actually a little surprised that she didn't hesitate for longer here, but perhaps her need for not being abandoned again is overpowering whatever PTSD-like symptoms she might have been feeling in that moment. Though we can clearly see the moment she activates the device, all of the memories come rushing back. We can see the bunny representing Vi, and when she says no, it was a mistake, this is the powder from the past talking. The post-traumatic stress just bringing back all of these memories and putting her back into that time and place that she was as a child when everything went wrong. I love how this scene shows how different Caitlyn and Vi are as people. Vi is parkouring through the streets, running as fast as she can. The music again emphasizing what she is feeling, which is freedom. After being cooped up in a prison for, we don't know how many years, she is finally free. Something which she probably never thought she would actually ever see again. While Caitlyn is shown as being scared and timid as she slowly climbs down, but even so, she is still courageous enough to follow Vi. It seems like Caitlyn wants to bring something back to show she is not just a councillor's daughter, or to find Silco. However, this world is unknown. She feels Vi can offer her what she wants, but it's still scary to travel into the unknown, but she does it anyway. So I feel like this scene shows a lot for both of their characters in just both really great and interesting ways. And another little thing I really love about this scene is how once Caitlyn finally gets to the bottom, we see the old man walking past the alleyway. The same old man that we saw just about to get on the tram that Caitlyn was about to get up to. And considering how slow he is walking, it probably took Caitlyn a significant amount of time to actually climb down. Jinx ran away from her failed experiment, still not having confronted what happened all those years ago. So it's pretty important for her that she goes back to the place of her childhood and confronts them. And that's what she's doing here in this scene. When she fights the machine here, she's symbolically fighting all of the memories of Vi, both the good and the bad ones, anything that's causing conflict within her, screaming and crying like she did as a child, though she is not destroying anything but trying to reach something, to see if she as an adult is as strong as Vi was in her memories. And that's why she's looking up at the board here, and that's why she also gets annoyed when her score doesn't beat Vi's. This, along with the food scene from earlier, emphasised the differences between Vi and Caitlyn, and the different ways that they see the world, and showing that they are on very different journeys. Caitlyn can't understand why Vi is eating this food. I mean, I'm pretty sure we as the audience can't understand why Vi is eating this food. Yet she doesn't know what it was like for Vi trapped in prison. And she has no memories of the food Vi used to eat as a child, which I'm sure we all look fondly on the food that we used to eat as a child, no matter how good or bad it might have been. And then we see the bar. All Caitlyn sees is a den for criminals, whereas this used to be the home for Vi. She remembers how her and her family used to hang out in the basement, the same room which Caitlyn says probably has bodies inside, which understandably makes Vi angry. Marcus still has the coin from Act 1. A reminder of what happened and a symbol showing that he cannot let go of it, that he is still struggling with what happened. An apt theme for this episode considering Jinx is going through something similar. This struggle is shown pretty clearly when Silco hands Marcus the grenade and he imagines sacrificing himself to kill Silco. I think this is a good time to talk about Marcus. In episode 3 I mentioned that I didn't get his dialogue in the scene where he captures Vi, and I still think the scene was changed, making the dialogue not quite fit. But it makes sense now when we really see the person Marcus is here. We can infer now that he wanted to save Vi from being killed by Silco. However, he still used her, putting her in Stillwater prison and hiding her records to potentially use her against Silco in the future. But what I really love about Marcus is how complex and relatable he is. He doesn't want to do what he's doing. In fact, it's pretty clear that he's disgusted at himself for doing it, and for knowing that he could never live up to Grayson's name, but he can't stop. It appears he can't kill Silco without killing himself, and if he turns in the information he has on Silco, it incriminates himself. And in both cases, he loses his family. And as we've already seen from this previous scene, what is he shooting for? His family, his daughter. And he is going to do whatever it takes to not lose his daughter. So he's put in a really tough position, and I think we can all almost emphasize with him that, you know, he is struggling in this position because I think most people would struggle in this position that he's in. He knows he should do the right thing. He knows that many lives could be saved, and every death that happens because of Silco or Jinx is partly his fault. But he cannot bring himself to do the right thing, and it's this struggle that makes him such an interesting character. Vi circles Caitlyn, getting in close and pressing Caitlyn up against the wall with her arm, testing Caitlyn, even flirting with her in a way to see how Caitlyn feels about her. I think this is one of the first biggest signs that Vi is into Caitlyn, and the start of the two of them getting closer. We've seen many scenes before this emphasizing the differences between the two, and that is definitely going to come up later, but both of those scenes also act to show us more about these two characters as they get to learn about each other. And as Vi is leaving, she sees Caitlyn comfortably talking to one of the girls, which puts a smile on her face, probably remembering how uncomfortable Caitlyn was when she pushed a male to her earlier, and not expecting that she would adapt so quickly to this new unknown environment. But more importantly, I think it's the fact that she's comfortable with women that puts that smile on Vi's face that makes her think that she was right about Caitlyn's preferences. The Medardas only take from the world and are not usually in a position to give anything back. Again, what I really like about Mel's character is how little we know about her, with little snippets of information like this coming through, and due to that, not knowing if we can trust her. And I really like how this scene is placed, purposefully right before Viktor's scene, showing us the growing rift between the two and how Jayce has changed. While Jayce has become more concerned with protecting the hextech and almost sacrificing his personal ambition, like Heimendinger mentioned with Stanwyck Padidley in the last episode, Viktor is working away in his lab, so focused on his work, shown by him not even noticing the feelings his assistant has for him, which is another point of comparison to Jayce, as right that moment, Jayce is currently with Mel. And this isn't even the first time. We can see back here in this scene that Viktor is busy working on something, while Jayce seems to be fixing his tie in the mirror. Had this been the Jayce of Act 1, I'm sure he would be right next to Viktor experimenting away. Vi is not used to having anyone save her, and I think this is the start of Vi really beginning to trust Caitlyn, and being able to rely on her in a way which she hasn't been able to do with anyone else before. Vi gives her a compliment, which seems unlike her character, especially after spending such a long time in prison, and this means something. She even asks Caitlyn to help her up, and this dialogue at the end as they walk away shows already how close the two have become, already thrown jokes off one another, which is a stark contrast to their dialogue at the start of the episode. And I just want to reiterate here, this is the reason why they didn't make us feel for Caitlyn in her flashback, like they did with Vi and Powder and Jayce. Caitlyn's actions of saving Vi not once, twice now, the prison and from Sevika, mean something to us as the viewers, as we care for Vi by this point. The flashback didn't need to make us care for Caitlyn because she brought Vi back to us, and that makes us care for her. And now in the story, she's not only saved Vi again, but becoming closer to her. Certainly, if we didn't care for her as a character before, we definitely do now. And then lastly, we can see here that Jinx is in the zone. The water scene seemingly working as she is able to work away at her creations, like happy and not afraid of them like she was before. And it seems like in this moment she may understand what Vi said to her as a child. What you do that is different makes you special. She is owning this, and she is not walking the path Vi left for her, but her own. In this scene, she is in the zone where nothing else matters. which is a really great build-up considering how this episode ends, with Silco finding out that Vi is alive, and this almost freedom that Jinx has achieved finally from her memories is about to be broken by the fact that her sister is there again. And in a way, things have almost flipped themselves in the head, because in the past, Powder had only good intentions and she ended up killing her family. And now I feel like Vi, again, almost has good intentions. She just wants to get Powder back, but just her presence being there, just Powder or Jinx finding out about her presence, could completely put her into disarray once again. The scenes in episode 5 really start to differ from the way they were presented to us in previous episodes. The scenes in this episode start to move more quickly than they have in previous episodes. This is partly to show the passage of time, but take the brothel scene for example. They didn't really need to split this into 2 scenes, and I don't think they really needed to show us where Powder was just because Vi mentions her. The answer really comes down to why are the scenes there and how can they be made interesting. Take the scene in episode 3 where Jace and Viktor are breaking into Heimerdinger's lab. It was a scene that needed to happen, but was made more interesting by including conflict, the conflict being Mel's appearance in the scene. In episode 5 there are a lot of scenes like this where certain things need to happen, but as there are so many of these scenes it's hard to introduce any kind of conflict. Some scenes do have this in particular the ones with Caitlyn, but others like with Jayce do not, and instead act as foreshadowing. For example, all the scenes with Marcus are small, but each one we start to see him falter just a little bit more, like bit by bit. And this couldn't have been achieved if they just had a few long scenes with Marcus in. We needed to see Marcus at different points in different time, but we didn't really need a longer scene to achieve this in. And certainly if there had been other conflict within these scenes, it wouldn't have been as good. It would have just kind of been a bit jarring. I definitely think they could have worked the conflict into 1 or 2 of these scenes, linking it into other things in the episode, but not with the amount of scenes that they obviously wanted to include of Marcus struggling with his decision in the show. And I think this all leads into another reason why the scenes are like this, which is pacing. As I just mentioned a moment ago, I think it would have been fairly easy for them to make all of these scenes longer and give each one a kind of conflict that would make them more interesting. But then another issue would arise, and that would be the feeling that we are getting nowhere fast. Brandon Sanderson, a very popular fantasy author, states that when he has pacing issues, he looks at the promise he has made to his audience. One of the ways of tackling pacing is to make sure his audience is always progressing towards that promise that he's made. Currently that promise is Silco and Jinx, more specifically Vi and Jinx meeting up again, and the conflict between the Undercity and Piltover. But I would agree that the main promise of the episode is Vi and Jinx reuniting, or at least getting closer to each other, and the lesser promise would be the conflict between Piltover and the Undercity. If the scenes are long with conflict that is not really related to this promise, then the show will start to feel like it's dragging. And lastly is the number of point of view characters. This is not just increased, but unlike in episode 1, they can't concentrate a whole episode on a set of characters like they could before. So there are not only more point of view characters, but each one is getting their own time, slowing down the pacing and making our progression towards that promise much slower. This is why Arcane makes its scenes shorter, to move us towards that promise faster, and in a way that hides the fact that its pacing has slowed down. Changing scenes quickly can also make things more interesting. This is especially true in books. Again, going back to Sanderson, who uses this very technique not only in the climax of Oathbringer, one of his more recent books, but also in the start of Rhythm of War, to subdue the effects of slow pacing. And here is the character map for episode 5. As you can see, there are a lot more links than there were in the last episode. I've also brought back a few characters, Grayson in particular here, and the family, which just means Vander, Clagger, and Milo, because I feel like even just their memory becomes relevant to this diagram when realizing that Silco is the one that basically killed Vander and almost led the family to death, even though Jinx was the one who, killed them in the end. Having that link there really kind of just emphasizes the kind of person he is and what he's done and everything in the past. But if we get into this, I've put Grayson here, which Marcus feels responsible for her death. We can see that she was someone important to Caitlyn, and it was Silco that killed her. And we can start to see now that why Caitlyn is looking for Silco, because the whole reason, as I mentioned before, the whole reason may not just be because of this. She might just be trying to do this as a way of proving that she's not just a counsellor's daughter. But we can start to see this more clearly from these links. And with the amount of links now coming off Caitlyn, we can kind of see clearly from this diagram that she has become a more important character in the story, just by the number of links that are now coming off of her into different characters, and definitely more main characters in the story. So I find very interesting in this one is there's a lot more links going. If we cut the bottom of this, just above the Firelights and Jinx, to Undercity characters compared to Piltover characters, we can see there are a lot more links going up into Piltover now from the Undercity than there were originally in the last episode. We can see just from this diagram that there are more things happening in this episode that are linking both the Overcity and the Undercity together. And I think this was really emphasised in the episode by Caitlyn and Vi. Many scenes showing us the differences between those two characters, who literally come from, one from the Undercity and one from Piltover. Mel still in particularly is by herself, though now she has a stronger link to Jayce in this, but again, we still don't know anything else about Mel. Other than her being a counsellor, we really have not seen any other links from her to other characters in this show. I've also added Miss Young, who is the assistant to Jace and Viktor, and who has feelings for Viktor. And even compared to Act 1, I think the complexity of this diagram really starts to show the amount of just different things that are happening to different characters within Arcane right now in Act 2, and how it's all expanding out and everything is kind of reaching into its climax. But anyway, that has been my analysis of episode 5 of Arcane. Hope you enjoyed that. If you made it this far, please don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe so you know when the next episode's coming out. This has been That Step Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In episode 5, we started to take a look at Viktor's troubles, his poor health, his lack of time. Unlike Jayce, he does not want to sacrifice personal ambition, but make something of himself before he passes, and this seems to be to enrich the lives of the people of the Undercity. And thus, like Caitlyn before, Viktor receives his own flashback sequence at the beginning of this episode, showing us who he is as a character. This girl sees what he's doing and leaves, neither trying to call out to one another. This small interaction shows us that Viktor is a bit of an outcast among the children, most likely because of his poor health and the cane that he needs to walk. This is shown to us as he fails to keep up with his toy ship that he's made, unable to move fast enough and tripping over his own legs. The scene even shows us how much trouble he has moving down this small slope. And here we are reintroduced to Singed, a character that on first watch I was unsure if we were going to see again. But this is another good example of how Arcane really likes to reuse everything it can, just trimming down all of that fat that it can possibly trim down in these episodes. Singed mentions that Rio, the creature in this scene, has a rare mutation and is dying. It's pretty easy to draw the parallels between Viktor and this creature, as Viktor appears to have been born different from the other children, and this difference is a detriment to him. More so, we know that the present day Viktor is dying as well. Viktor wants to help Rio, his decision no doubt made at least in part from loneliness and in part from seeing himself in Rio. The loneliness aspect I feel hits a little here, as on the previous episode, we see Viktor working while Jayce is out at parties and events or with Mel. And I can't help but feel that this scene was crafted to make these comparisons, Jayce being one of the normal kids and leaving Viktor to play on his own, showing that Viktor may feel that nothing has really changed and is still stuck on past issues. Like with the other flashback scene, this brings Viktor forwards in our minds in relevance as a character. Before he was merely just Jayce's partner, but now he is his own character with his own struggles and ambitions. I mentioned earlier that unlike Jayce, Viktor does not want to sacrifice his personal ambition, and this is shown pretty clearly in the scene with Heimerdinger. He's thinking over things at the spot that Heimerdinger found him at as a child. And naturally, if you're in this position mulling over things, you're going to want to talk about what you've just been thinking about. And the first thing that he talks about to Heimerdinger is how Heimerdinger's legacy is secured, that he will be remembered even when he passes away. Without him saying it directly, we can infer that Viktor does indeed care about his personal ambitions and wants to make something of himself before he passes. And it's no fluke that Heimerdinger looks down at the butterfly as it lands here, the average butterfly having a lifespan of about 2 weeks or less, further emphasising that Viktor does not have much time left. I feel like this could also be a little bit of setup for the future, in that, like how a caterpillar morphs into a butterfly, we may see a similar change within Viktor. Mel painting here is clearly annoyed at Jayce, not even turning to look at him as he speaks, even the sound of her voice being a little tense. But Jayce tells her about Viktor's condition and how Viktor saved his life. And as he says this, he looks towards the crystal on his hand. And I thought this was really interesting as it shows that Jayce now considers Viktor saving his life to be just as important as the time he was saved as a child. And this emphasizes just how much he cares and how much this news is affecting him. It's obvious that Mel can't stay mad at Jayce, and finally we get to learn a bit about her. She opens up for the first time, not giving us everything we want, but just enough to keep us interested in her and what her past might be. And the information she does give is similarly themed on being an outcast and loneliness, which I feel like is a really natural way to bring up her past in the writing, and that isn't something that comes out of nowhere, but is something related to the current situation that she feels like she has in common with. I wanted to point out that what Viktor sees here is shown later in a sort of flashback with Heimerdinger, from where magic caused a great catastrophe. It creates an ominous feeling, and we'll notice this with all the hexcore magic scenes later in this episode. The ominous feelings it gives off, alluding to just how dangerous what they're doing, how they are essentially playing with fire. And I feel like this could be foreshadowing perhaps for Season 2, where they may choose to go deeper down this magic hole, and there could be serious consequences because of it. Theorem, or Chuck, as Jinx calls him, is clearly on edge around her, and I doubt it's fear, but likely the fact that he's been told not to let Jinx know what's going on. You can see he's clearly nervous here. But what I really want to point out in this scene is how happy Jinx seems to be. In one of her last scenes, Jinx told Silco that she was scared due to what happened in the past. And he relates as he felt the same way, but he managed to come out of it, and he wants her to go through something similar so that she can come out of it like he did. Silco found strength within him when he was almost drowned by Vander, and wants to give Jinx this same opportunity, placing her in the water like what happened to him. I'll speak more about this scene and Silco later, but I wanted to highlight again how this seems to affect Jinx. She appears to be completely different from the previous Jinx, though as we find out later this may have just been like a band-aid on her problems. And one thing I really like here about Jinx's character is that we find out from the next scene that she notices that something is wrong here with Chuck, that there's something that Chuck isn't telling her, but she doesn't let that show, compared to Chuck himself who clearly can't keep a secret without showing that he's hiding something. And notice how this scene quietly reminds us of Caitlyn and Vi and what happened to them before moving on to the next scene, which is about them. And it's been quite a while since we last saw them, the start of this episode focusing on Viktor. This is a nice little technique Arcane uses to remind the viewers of certain relevant bits of information before going into the scene where they're needed. And we've seen this technique before, time and time again, but just as an example, in episode 4, before we meet Caitlyn, we're introduced to Jayce and her parents first, before finally moving over onto Caitlyn, loading all of the relevant information into our minds before we actually get to the scene where we need it. I really love this scene. The show don't tell here is so good that I feel like I'm almost just going to be given the play-by-play but that's just a testament to how good it is. Jinx knocks out Sevika and then begins to interrogate her. She brings up Sevika's arm, and we know the two have a sore spot for each other, likely due to the arm Jinx was responsible for destroying, and she goes straight for that point. But Sevika knows exactly what to say to get under Jinx's skin, even going as far as to say that Vi has replaced her, and saying Jinx, not in a positive reinforcement that Powder has tried to make it, but in a negative way, like how Milo used to call her in the past. And you can see how smugly Sevika looks here, believing she has won, and Jinx realizes this and sneezes, pulling herself back together and pretending like it hasn't gotten to her, so as not to give Sevika that satisfaction. And I love what Jinx does to Sevika after this. In the past, she would have been humiliated by Milo, but not able to do anything back. And after all these years, she likely has so much pent-up frustration from this that when someone tries to humiliate her, in this case Sevika wanting to humiliate her in front of Silco, she lets all of that out and does it back to Sevika, humiliating her in front of Silco in a way worse way than she would have done to Jinx. Silco knows Marcus has been wavering, and his act here of showing up at Marcus's house is to show Marcus that he knows what Marcus cares about. But also now that Vi has been seen, he turns to the one person that should know about it. Likely Silco has figured out that Marcus has lied to him, because as we find out later in the scene, Marcus told him that Vi was dead, but hadn't said a word to him about her still being alive in all the times he's seen Silco up to this point. And so this act by Silco is partly to tell Marcus that if he does something like that again, it won't be him that suffers the consequences. Also notice the guys Silco brings with him to this scene. One of them is cross-eyed and reading a book, though it seems like he's just pretending or acting out what he's seen other people do. Dark paint under his eyes, yellow teeth and tattoos on his fingers. Then he accidentally tears a page as he's turning it. And I love the wording Silco uses, using the story of Vander and Vi to ask Ren if she can imagine being separated from her father. The words clearly having a separate meaning when directed at Marcus. I feel like the pet Heimerdinger has is almost like a representation of his emotions. We know what he thinks of magic, and as Viktor shows him the hexcore, a magic that evolves, the pet whimpers and hides back behind Heimerdinger. And I feel like this is what Heimerdinger is feeling in his heart right now. He says that Viktor has changed, and though Viktor says he doesn't know what Heimerdinger means, there is a weird smile on his face. It's not truly explained, but I feel that's best considering how little we know about magic right here. However, looking back, we can see Viktor getting so focused on working on the hexcore that he forgets everything else, and we think this is because of his bad health and little time that he has left, but perhaps it might be due to something else. And earlier, when he was seeing these like blue chords in his vision, perhaps it's the magic that's doing this, that's corrupting him slowly without him even realizing it. I should also note here that he looks healthier in this scene, so it could be something that happened when he touched the hexcore directly in the scene before. Caitlyn's gun is important to her. We know this from the flashback with Grayson and how she takes pride in her aim. We can even see in the family portrait in her mansion that she's holding a gun. So it wouldn't be far off to say that this gun is like a part of her. But she doesn't hesitate to trade this gun away for the potion to save Vi when she sees the woman begin to pull the potion away. And despite Huck's deformities, Caitlyn doesn't hesitate to hug him closely, as he's been responsible for saving Vi. Notice the sly smile from Marcus here. Jayce has just been played. Marcus wants to set up this barricade on the bridge to search everyone that passes so he can make sure to get to Vi and Caitlyn before anyone else does, and make sure that they don't return. And even giving Jayce the information that Caitlyn had a prisoner released on his order, sowing the seed for the story he will tell when he will bring back news of her death. There is no hesitation in his actions here, whereas before we saw him struggle with what he was doing, here he seems resolute, reminded of what's most important to him and doing everything he can to protect that. This scene is so heartbreaking. I'm not sure Jayce would have spoken up had Heimerdinger not said anything, but here he has to choose between his mentor and his partner. Someone who saved his life and is currently dying, and his mentor, someone he looks up to and admires. We can see in the scene with Marcus before the meeting how distracted Jayce is, and just how he is struggling with what he might have to do. And we can see from the expression on the faces how hard this is for both of them. Humans don't live for centuries. This has been set up right from episode 2, when we first met Heimerdinger, where we find out how old he is and how fearful of magic he is. And then in each scene leading up to this, we see how he rejects any advancements made by Jace and Viktor. I mentioned in an earlier episode that he didn't understand the lifespan of a human and how short it is to his own, but watching the earlier scene with the hexcore, I feel like this might have just been a byproduct of his fear. It's very possible that Heimerdinger does understand the lifespan of a human. I mean, he's been surrounded by humans since Piltover's birth, but it is his fear in magic that has caused him to be precautious and even give excuses. He does so out of fear of magic, but to Jace and Viktor, it feels like he doesn't understand the lifespan of a human. And this is because Heimerdinger doesn't want to tell them how much he fears magic and doesn't want to relive what he witnessed in the past. Earlier we see how Viktor might have been corrupted by the hextech, and I feel the same can be said of the council, but in a different way. Each of them have had a taste of magic, of the advancements and wealth it can bring them. But each of them likely look up to Heimerdinger the same way Jayce does. They would have all been children looking up to Heimerdinger on the council at one point, him being a sturdy rock throughout their lives, but now they are being forced to choose between him and magic. And regardless of whether this choice is done out of greed or loyalty, we can see that each and every one of them struggle with this decision. And Jayce most of all, even after declaring the motion, he hesitates to raise his hand for a moment at the end. You can feel so much of this without any of it being said in perhaps one of the best displays of show don't tell in the whole series, making one of the most powerful scenes in Arcane. Vi wakes, still seeing flashes of her past, and where Caitlyn is, she sees her mother. Both have similar hair colour, but more importantly, the fact that she is unconsciously seeing Caitlyn in this position shows us just how much she trusts Caitlyn and how much she views Caitlyn already as a place of safety. And this scene highlights more of the differences between Vi and Caitlyn. To Caitlyn, it's odd that Vi doesn't have parents, and in fact, they were killed by enforcers, the current profession she is. She still doesn't fully grasp how dangerous it is down in the Undercity for the children growing up there. Finally here we see that Silco has caught up with them. We see Huck taking the shimmer, likely having given into the temptation and sold out Vi, which very thematically represents the struggles many of the characters have gone through in this episode, or rather the weaknesses of them not being able to overcome such a struggle. We can see this with Jayce earlier having to go against Heimendinger without being able to come to a compromise, and Marcus who finally falls into line and does what Silco wants him to do. And now with Huck giving into temptation and taking the shimmer. And we can see all the way back in episode 1 that he was an addict. It's a small touch, but we can see that when Vander pours the beer back in this episode, you can see the longing in his eyes and his finger tap on the counter as if gesturing to the mug. And also the scene where Caitlyn gets the medicine, we can see Huck's eyes lingering on the potion that looks to have shimmer in it. He's already an addict and we can tell it all the way from back here in this first scene. Which, just to add again, is something I love of just how in depth even Huck, who has only a couple of minutes in the entire season of Arcane, has been ridden with so much depth of character. This episode almost feels like it has been themed around the failure of these struggles. But I feel that this is why Caitlyn's actions here are that much more impactful. She, along with Vi, are still struggling and fighting to succeed. And seeing everyone else around them giving up makes us want them to succeed all the more. Jinx here risks being abandoned again if Vi doesn't show up. She puts everything on the line to do what she is doing. And here we see her dead family, Milo symbolising her pain, crying a silent scream, and Clagger looking up in hope. Both showing the internal struggle going on inside Jinx at this moment. Pain and fear in the form of Milo, that she will be abandoned again and Vi won't show up though she promised she would, affirming the belief that she is a Jinx and unwanted. And hope in the form of Clagger that Vi will keep her promise and show up. And considering how much of a tragedy Act 1 was, it's almost a little surprising that Vi actually managed to show up here. It would have been so easy to see Vi not being able to turn up at this point, and this rift in Jinx of who she is, Powder or Jinx, finally being settled at this moment, like pushing her to that point of no return. And that would have been such an easy way for the writers to make this happen. But it's really great here how they're like, no, it isn't going to happen like this. We're going to go down the hard path and really fight to have this struggle between Powder and Jinx happen, and which will eventually lead to that conclusion in episode 9. Jinx has kept the flare the entire time because she has kept onto that hope that Vi will come back. And Vi hugs Powder, clearly showing how much she's missed her. And in that moment, Jinx drops the Hex gemstone. This shows us that her sister is more important to her than Silco's mission, and that her sister is more important to her than Silco is. But when Caitlyn arrives, we can tell that what Sevika told her has gotten under her skin, and she believes that Vi has replaced her. And we can tell here that she is actually hearing auditory hallucinations, as Milo affirms her negative assumptions, Jinx spatting back at him, and the others asking who she's talking to. And as things start to escalate, Vi sees that what she said to her sister all those years ago has affected her in such a way that has changed her identity. She tells Jinx that she's not going to leave her again, no matter what, and touches her delicately. The two used to cuddle and touch heads in the past, and this is Vi's way of showing that she wants to go back to the way things were before, to how close they were before. But we can also see that when Vi touches her, the distortion happens for when the voices are talking to Jinx. And in that moment, without there even being words being said, we can tell the struggle Jinx is having internally, that she's telling herself that this can't be happening, that it's just a dream, one that she's clung to all these years, and that she's a Jinx, so she would never be lucky enough for something like this to happen to her. And we can tell that this is something that Jinx fought, because when Vi hugs her initially, she asks, "Are you real?" Jinx has gone through so much trauma, especially the one of being called a Jinx by her own sister, and likely coming to believe that she could never be lucky enough for Vi to come back and tell her that she didn't abandon her. And I love what happens when the Firelights show up. As we've seen through Act 2, how close Vi and Caitlyn get, needing to rely on each other through traumatic events. This highlights just how close Vi and Jinx still are, regardless of what they say to each other, regardless of how they fight. They're siblings and they trust one another, and as they now have to fight, they are immediately back to back here. And finally, Vi seeing Powder smile as she attacks the Firelights. This is likely something that she has been praised for by Silco in the past, and Vi blaming herself for this change in Jinx, this change in her sister, thus ending Act 2 of Arcane. So this is the character map for Episode 6, finale of Act 2 of Arcane. There hasn't been too many changes, and this is how it should be. Like with Episode 3 and Act 1, generally when you're doing a story and you're doing your beginning, middle, and end, there's not going to be too many extra characters past that halfway point, or past that like 2/3 point. And I know this is like technically, you know, Episode 3 of 6, if we're counting Act 2 and Act 3 as like one big story, but it's still a part of the story that is leading up to a climax. And generally we don't get too many new characters or too many new things introduced to, you know, past that point. I guess firstly, to start off with Viktor, we can see here that we've got more links now coming off of Viktor, especially if we consider how many links Viktor had in Act 1 compared to now in Act 2. And it's easy to see here who the main characters are of the show. We can see how many links Jayce has coming off of him. We can see how many links Caitlyn has coming off of her. We can see how many links Jinx has coming off of her. And it's kind of interesting in a way that Vi does not have that many links coming off of her. She still has a lot of links coming off of her, but not quite as many as some of the other characters here. But I think we'll see later on, as Act 3 starts happening and Vi's relevance becomes pushed forward to the forefront, that we'll see more links develop from her character. Since Act 1, Viktor has gotten a link to his assistant, Miss Young. He's got a link to Singe, and he's got a link to Rio, that kind of pet that he really kind of sees himself in and really cared for as a child. Mel is still very much by herself, just waiting to have more links added to her, waiting to be pushed closer into the forefront. And Marcus, I've added his daughter in here, just to show that, you know, because of how important she is to him, because she is the reason why he is doing what he is doing. And kind of as almost like a byproduct of all this, we see more links going into Silco as his character relevance just becomes greater and greater and greater, especially when you compare this to what his character map looked like in Episode 4, the first part of Act 2. But other than that, there's not too much more to be said from here. I guess we can compare what this is like to, you know, compared to the beginning of Act 2 to the end of Act 2. And we can see that, you know, really there has been a lot more links that have happened, especially when you compare this to the diagram in Act 1. There are a lot more links happening all over the place. And like the barrier between Piltover and the Undercity is almost gone when you look at this diagram. Compared to Act 1, when you see that diagram, you can see there was just a stark difference with barely any links from the Undercity to Piltover. But now we can see there are a whole lot of links as all these characters are all interacting with each other in different ways. And that has been the Act 2 finale of Arcane. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this. If you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button so you know when Episode 7's come out. And if you made it this far in the video, please don't hesitate to hit that like button. This has been That's Evan Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This episode starts with Firelight's propaganda. They are now in the forefront after kidnapping Caitlyn and Vi, and this almost acts the same as flashbacks, telling us the audience that they are now going to become relevant and important to the story, as well as showing us a bit more about why they are fighting. I find it interesting that they didn't have a flashback scene for Ekko. Yes, I think it would have hurt the reveal in that it wouldn't have been as much of a surprise, but a flashback scene between him and Powder and Vi might have gone a long way here. In each flashback so far, we've seen a scene that defines that character and tells us who they are. With Ekko, this might be different, as he's changed a lot since he was a child. Really, I think if it was to be a scene about who he is, we'd probably see the moment as a child that he stops grieving over Benzo and Vi and chooses to stand up and fight. And this could have been linked with the bridge scene at the end of this episode. If it's a moment that he resolves himself to fight and save his friends, Jinx being his childhood friend, that could have been something that he remembers in that moment when he's fighting Jinx. It could have also been the moment he creates the Firelights, providing the same purpose as the scene that we actually got at the beginning of this episode, which brings them to the forefront. So it's rather interesting that they didn't have one. Now, this could be because he isn't considered as important of a character as the others. At the very least, he doesn't have the kind of story arc that Viktor does and doesn't appear too much outside of this episode, at least when he's not wearing his mask and everything. It's also possible that writers have plans for him for Season 2, and thus we might see a flashback for him in Season 2. But it's still interesting that we got this as opposed to a flashback. Maybe that's something someone else might have some ideas on, so feel free to comment your thoughts below on this. And though not really shown to us, Ekko has been through just as much as Vi and the others. Benzo getting killed in front of him in episode 3, and then likely finding out that all of his childhood friends had been killed by Silco, except for Powder, now Jinx, who is actually working for him. There's a story called Lord of the Flies, in which a bunch of kids are stranded on an island with no adults to guide them. Many of the children start putting face paints over their face as a way of adapting to this new world, where civilization is dead and savagery becomes commonplace. I said in episode 4 Ekko's mask was a product of necessity for the writing, the Firelights likely also using them to hide their identities from Silco. But I am also reminded of the Lord of the Flies here as he takes his mask off and is hugged by Vi. I feel that his mask also acted as a coping mechanism for Ekko, a way of holding back the pain and suffering. When he has his mask on, he isn't the boy Ekko but the leader of the Firelights, and that person doesn't feel the same as Ekko. And if we look closer at Ekko's dialogue in this scene, he doesn't trust Vi. He thinks she might be working for Silco. And I think this says something about the mind space he's been in over the last few years. We know that Powder was his friend, thus we can only imagine what he must think finding out that she's working for the man that killed her family. And if this truly negative thing is true, then anything could be true. And imagine this immensely negative outset that could have built up in his mind from this. But when Vi hugs him, she's not only shown him that he can trust her, having had the opportunity to hurt him, but she's also likely given him the first hug he's had since she was thrown in prison. And in that moment, we can tell he's just able to let go of everything that has been like keeping him tensed and wound up. We've seen Jayce almost purely in the council or in the lab, but we'd be remiss to forget that he comes from a family of blacksmiths. And for why he's here, we learn that he's stressed, worried about Caitlyn and Viktor and the impending threat of the Undercity. Blacksmithing is likely something he did with his father, something he has fond memories of. So just like we might play games or watch movies, Jayce is escaping the world with blacksmithing to relieve the stress that he's built up. And this not only adds a little more depth to his character, but also shows that he's pretty strong, so that when we get to a certain scene in a later episode, him going to the front lines and fighting won't seem as far-fetched. In the last couple scenes, we've seen Ekko stressed, we've seen Jayce stressed, we've seen Viktor stressed, and now we see Silco stressed. This definitely seems to be an opening episode of stress, almost as a theme here. And we get to and it's interesting because we do get to see the different ways in which all these characters relieve their stress. Ekko with Vi, Viktor not really relieving his stress, but obviously just dealing with it by going to Singed, and Jayce by blacksmithing. And here we see Silco, and he has a lot going on. The Ken Barons want to have an assembly with him, and Vi and Caitlyn are on the loose, not to mention the loss of business that he's having due to the blockades. But despite all of this stress, his first priority is finding Jinx. And if you notice the ashtray he uses in this scene, it has Jinx's drawings on. We can also see in another scene later on in the episode that he keeps other items on his desk that Jinx has either made or doodled on. Sevika has been cleaned up, as has his office, so I don't think he just kept this ashtray because he could have gotten new ones. He keeps it as a gift from daughter to father, and I think this scene is trying to show that as he stubs his cigar out on it right before he tells Sevika that he needs to find Jinx. But I feel here we can tell that their relationship has progressed to the point where she may also consider him a bit of a friend. In fact, I almost get the feeling of family when she's telling him that Jinx will come back. Her fighting with Jinx in a way is like that of siblings, where ultimately, despite how much they fight, she actually cares for Jinx. Jayce will understand. In the previous scene where Viktor takes the Shimmer variant, he still believes that Jayce will understand him. Viktor wants to help the Undercity, but everything Jayce is doing seems to be against that, and this is shown clearly by his way of thinking here. Jayce is lumping everyone in the Undercity together, and Viktor kind of includes himself in that group, which gets him annoyed, ultimately leading him to not tell Jayce about this Shimmer variant. And I know I've said this like many times before throughout Arcane, but I really just love how natural conflict is brought up in these episodes, and how their nature just conflicts with one another that just builds this conflict. We can see right from the start that the Chem Barons are against Silco, annoyed with the current events, and this is all shown by the guy in the yellow coat, Finn, talking to the others, trying to sway them before Silco even gets to the meeting. And notice that the meeting is held in a very high up building, showing us that the people here are rich, the leaders of the Undercity, considering themselves above others. Silco is doing the eye thing himself and appears to be having trouble with it. This could be from stress from the day, but it could also be the fact that Jinx may have taken over this role for the last couple of years, and Silco has just been out of practice himself, having allowed Jinx to do it for him. And Silco doesn't try to fight back in this situation, which really shows how much he cares for Jinx, that he's willing to allow her to stick him with this needle, but doesn't do anything to try and push her off. I am your family. Everyone else betrays us. This is really interesting from Silco's end, because it's clear that Silco cares for Jinx and thinks of her as his daughter, but his actions aren't necessarily what is best for her. We know that what's best for Jinx is for her to make up with Vi, and for all intents and purposes become powder again. But Silco sees her as being the same as him, and thus thinks what is best for her is what was best for him. We can tell this by his words, but I feel like he may be deluding himself a bit. Jinx has become important to him, and he doesn't want to lose her, but at least subconsciously he knows that if Vi isn't dealt with, he might lose her. And when he does tell this to Jinx, we can see the conflict in her from the voices she hears, affirming what Silco is saying, that they're not here for her, they're here for the gemstone. And you can see the sadness in her face from it. I like how this is one of the very first scenes that starts to hint towards Silco prioritizing Jinx over everything else. We saw this in the previous scene where he's stressed and his first thought is finding Jinx. But this is the first scene where we kind of see the hint where he's almost deluding himself into still believing that he cares for the creation of Zaun more than Jinx, so to speak. Ekko starts to trust Caitlyn. This scene is what a lot of Act 2 has built towards. Caitlyn seeing what things are like in the Undercity and seeing that they are not all the same. This has been built up by her relationship with Vi. And Ekko is distrusting, especially of Piltover forces. And had Caitlyn not been through everything she has with Vi, I doubt Ekko would have come to trust her. But her way of thinking has changed in such a short amount of time. I think Caitlyn would have been more like Jayce before, lumping all of the Undercity together, but Vi and their journey has changed that. And I really like how this raises Caitlyn's importance as a character. I mentioned in the last episode that everyone is struggling and kind of giving in to their struggles, and Caitlyn is still the one fighting against that. And in this episode, we see that Caitlyn has kind of almost become a bridge between Piltover and the Undercity, able to understand both sides and having the trust of Ekko and Vi. And we know from earlier on in the episode that Jayce is kind of lumping in everyone together. And thus we, as the viewers, can make that link that Caitlyn is what Jayce needs right now. Caitlyn is the one that can convince Jayce, that can change things here, that can, change his way of thinking and bring people back around. And I think this is just a really cool way of really elevating her character and really raising almost the stakes for her needing to get back to the Overcity and kind of almost fix things. Caitlyn hugs Vi aggressively, showing how close the two have become. But Jinx sees this, and we see Milo next to her, symbolising all of her negative thoughts and feelings. And then when we hear the gunshot and Vi runs back for Caitlyn, Jinx says liar, as Vi said before that she wouldn't leave her, and Vi was going back to find her, but has now prioritised Caitlyn over her, at least in Jinx's mind. And though Marcus here shoots Ekko without hesitation, he hesitates with Caitlyn. There have been many deaths that have happened due to him not reporting Silco, but none have been done by his own hand. This would have been the first, and if he shoots her, he knows he would go down a path he can't return from. He wouldn't be the martyr he envisions himself to be, but the villain. And to speak a little about Jinx's firebombs here, there is something I like to consider satisfying the reader whenever a leap in skill or power is shown like this is shown. What I mean by this is, we look at this plan Jinx has done and think it's cool, in a way. She was able to create these small bombs and trick the Piltians into thinking they were Firelights. But that's because Arcane has done its job and made it satisfying. It built up all the steps earlier in the episode to show us these. Firstly, we've seen in Act 2 that Jinx is a great engineer. This fact has been built up in Act 1. And even in this episode where we see Viktor taking apart Jinx's grenade and commenting that whoever made it must have been a genius in what they do, he's essentially putting Jinx on the same level as him and Jayce in that regard. But we are also introduced to the Firelights in this episode, not only showing us that this is where Ekko's gang got their name from, but informing us that they are natural creatures in this area. And thus we get a satisfying leap in which Jinx has used this information to trick the Piltover soldiers and displayed her ingenuity to make these bombs. I don't think this would have been terribly unsatisfying or unrealistic of a step had we not known about this information beforehand, but there are plenty of scenarios in other shows and movies and such where it would be. But Arcane takes the time to set all of this up properly, which I think it needs to be commended for. As Vi helps up Caitlyn, we see Jinx's visual hallucinations. In her mind, Caitlyn is not hurt and barely conscious, but grinning and taunting her, as she is with Vi now, that Jinx has been replaced. And I do find it a little weird here that Vi chooses to leave rather than stay with Jinx. You could argue that she could have asked Ekko to switch places with her, but as Jinx has guns, this might not have been the safest option. But perhaps it shows just how much Caitlyn means to Vi, that she is willing to leave Jinx to get Caitlyn out of harm's way. We can see that Vi can't believe what Jinx has done, that she has killed so many, but I still feel it contradicts what she was saying as they entered the bridge, that she wanted to stay to find Jinx. And that she doesn't even say a word to Jinx. Perhaps she's too heartbroken at this time that she can't even recognize her and blaming herself for all of it. But this is one point of contention I think I've seen a fair bit online as well, where it just seems a little odd from Vi's character that she kind of leaves at this point. But considering how very, very, very few scenes there are like this in Arcane where we're like, oh, that's a bit odd. I'm aware that Arcane is, likely had to do this to set up the battle between Jinx and Ekko, but it does feel a tiny bit forced. But compared to how immaculate the rest of the series is, it stands out a bit in this scene. When Jinx speaks here, we can feel the deep-rooted emotion in her voice.
Oh, look who it is. The boy savior.
Her sister is abandoning her again, choosing Caitlyn over her, and Ekko, who was her childhood friend, is supporting Vi in this. And it really feels like she almost can't believe this, that Ekko is taking Vi's side here. And with Ekko, I feel like there are so many emotions going through him at this moment, all displayed by the reactions on his face here. When he looks down, he's sad but resolved, as if to say, why are you making me do this? And when he chuckles, he remembers something from the past. And then Jinx mimics that same movement. And even without a conversation, Jinx knows what Ekko wants to do and accepts it. There's almost like a respect between the two of them. And then as Ekko swings the clock, we see them remembering the game they used to play as kids, knowing that at one point they were close friends. You can see the emotions going through them, showing the game they would play with toy guns and swords, all the while giving us a plausible explanation for why Ekko would be able to dodge all of Jinx's shots. But whereas they were kids, Ekko would lose, as adults, he wins. And seeing them remember their days of playing as kids is also what makes the next moment so heartbreaking, as we see the brutality displayed by Ekko as he punches Jinx. Perhaps in a fight or flight reaction from almost dying, or perhaps venting all of the anger he has held at Jinx for all the Firelight she has killed. But he still remembers them playing as kids, and this stops him. I think this shows that even though he said to Vi that Powder could never come back, he didn't really believe it himself. You can kind of see this earlier, as when he enters the scene here, first knocking Jinx's gun away and then grabbing the bag, where both times he probably could have hit her instead. And also with the game they recreated, if he had thought Powder was gone forever, then why try and make her play a game they did as kids? And Jinx letting off a suicide grenade here is especially sad. From her perspective, she's failed. Vi has been taken from her, has rejected her and abandoned her again. This is the fear I was talking about in episode 6, where she lights that flare. The kind of feelings that she would feel if Vi never turned up, if she didn't keep her promise. She's now feeling them here. But as well as that, she's had to fight her childhood friend, who she also considers to have abandoned her. She's already going through so much trauma, defeated and hopeless without Vi. And all of this, I think, is just too much for her to handle. So rather than live through it again, she'd just rather end it here. Straight from the writers, we actually find that Vi left with Caitlyn here because yes, Caitlyn was hurt and needed help, but also that Vi did not think that Jinx was in a place where she would be able to easily talk her down from. And emotions are high in this scene, and Vi has already seen what happened last time she tried to talk to Powder when she was emotional. And we can see at the start of the next episode that she was going to go back for Jinx, but couldn't due to the presence of Silco and the other enforcers. And this is the character map for episode 7. So I've kept the same one from the last act because they are essentially just carrying on from each other. But I've added a couple more links to it. As we can see, we've got the Chem Barons coming off of Silco now, who are kind of like his subordinates, kind of like his partners in a way, governing the Undercity. And we should see more about these guys, I think, later on as they link into certain things in different ways that you might not quite expect. But this is kind of like the start of almost like a mini story arc at the moment, where they don't really have any other links coming from them just yet. I've also added a link from Singe to Heimendinger, as he makes a comment that he parted ways from Heimendinger in the past, which means he could have been Heimendinger's assistant or he could have been Heimendinger's partner at one point. I've added a death symbol to Marcus here. And I guess most of them is I've changed the Firelights with Ekko. He kind of represents the Firelights as well here. And added a link between Ekko and Vi and Ekko and Caitlyn. And we can see, Vi gaining more links in this episode, becoming more of an important character as, she's already an important character, but becoming more of like a main character, as does Caitlyn in this episode. And that's really it for links here. Again, this is, we are well into the story now. Most of the characters have been introduced to us, if not all of the characters have been introduced to us. And currently, we're just seeing what new links are created, how these characters are interacting with each other, and how things play out. And that has been my analysis for episode 7 of Arcane. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and if you'd like to be notified when the penultimate episode of this comes out, feel free to subscribe to the channel and maybe give the video a like. This has been That's Steph and Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. We know that Mel is an outcast, at least if she is to be believed, but we also know she wanted to put Piltover on the map. From what we can glean from this cutscene, I feel it's quite possible that she wants to prove to her mother that she is wrong to have outcast her, that she made the wrong choice all those years ago. Revealing this to us, I believe, is made to make us care more for her character. After all, there are other characters in Arcane that have been outcast, or I guess similarly betrayed, such as Viktor, Jinx, and even Silco. And her want to prove herself again is shown in characters like Jayce and Jinx. Her backstory has a lot of similar themes to other characters, and I feel that this is purposeful, so as the writers want to keep the mystique around her character and around whether or not we can still trust her. Clever to charm her subjects, but palatable, so we can easily mold her. Old habits die hard, and I feel that what Mel said all those years ago has been exactly what she has been doing to Jayce. However, we also see compassion in her as a child, quite possibly the reason why she was outcast. And I feel her mother's last words, "A wolf has no mercy," were meant to be directed to us, as in the scene she looks down on a sleeping Jayce, vulnerable and defenseless in the present. I really like how the scene shows us more about Mel, about her compassionate side, making us care more for her, but at the same time doesn't undo the mystique around her character. Yes, we see compassion, but we still don't know what she has planned for Jayce. As I mentioned before, old habits die hard. The painting symbolising that scene with the blood and death behind her, and the sirens blaring in the background, all point to something more sinister, and perhaps something she might be battling against internally. And I like how her mother's face was in shadow throughout the scene, painting her almost as the big bad boogie monster in Mel's eyes. This scene is shown from Mel's perspective, and that's how she chooses to remember her, perhaps blotted out due to trauma of the event she experienced throughout her childhood. But it could also be she sees her mother as this unobtainable height of accomplishment that she will never reach, or as someone she will never gain approval from. Overall, I really like the scene as it both tells a lot of things by dialogue, while also telling a lot of things by show don't tell, and gives a lot of things to think about in regards to Mel's character and all the things she has done previous to this episode. In Mel's flashback, her mother talks about a story of getting a gold coin for all the swords she collected from dead soldiers, this being to teach her about death. And I feel this story rings in our minds as we see both Mel and Jayce shocked at the scene on the bridge with all the dead bodies of all the soldiers. And it's clear to see how different Mel and Jayce both see this scene. We're still not sure at this point if Mel has had that same training that her mother went through. If she obviously knows death more than Jayce, but does she know it as well as her mother? And the difference between her and Jayce are very clear to see in this episode. Just the difference in their expressions, the way Jayce froze up after seeing all of these bodies, and very likely also feeling the weight and pressure of him being responsible for this, in a way. I believe this is the moment where the idea is cemented in Vi's head that she can't save Powder without dealing with Silco first. And we can see as this episode goes on, with Vi first appealing to the council and then taking matters into her own hands. Whereas before this point, yes, she fought Sevika, but only because she was looking for Powder. It's interesting how they start this scene with Singed doing something to his face. Likely some injury caused by the explosion that Jinx created in episode 3. Only for the very person who hurt him to be brought in by Silco and have their fate rest in his hands. I'm not sure if this was to build tension or just remind us of that fact, but this issue doesn't seem to play into Singed's decision to help her. And I kind of ponder about this scene as to its intentions. Why did they start off with Singed doing something to, seemingly like peeling off the wrappings, I guess, from flesh, from like burnt or scarred flesh on his face? We're not quite sure. A bit later on when we see him working on Jinx and there's like a gap in his mask, we do get to see a bit of his face, and it's kind of a bit odd. We're not quite sure what this is covering, what these bandages are covering, but so I just thought it was kind of interesting that they started off with this as if to kind of almost bring up this tension but then not really follow through with it. Maybe it shows Singed's character that, he doesn't care about things like this. All he cares about is his science, and he is more excited to use Jinx as a test subject for this new Shimmer variant than worrying about paying her back for what she did to him. But I haven't read any more of the information about Singed outside of our Arcane, so if anyone has any more information that might be relevant to this, then please comment that down below and let me know. There's a lot displayed on Mel's face as her mother arrives. You can tell that there are memories rushing back to her, potentially fond ones, but ultimately ending in anger and resolve. Your brother's gone. We know Mel looked up to her brother Kino, as in the flashback she mentions him saying that the war is a failure of statecraft. If Mel is at conflict with herself, then this could be a big blow to that. Her brother, seemingly against war and the way their mother did things, is now dead, in a way proving that his way was the wrong way. This is also the trigger for her arrival. War is coming, and she wants hextech weapons to give her an edge. I feel like we'll see this internal conflict in Mel play out a little more in this episode. Maybe not quite as visible as someone like Jayce is, but we'll see it more in the council scene later. And a little side note to kind of end this scene, I feel like when we do get a season 2, and if it does go beyond Piltover, then Mel's brother could be a likely candidate for a POV character. That is, if he is still alive. I feel like his death has been the inciting incident for a lot of events, and his motivations go against Mel's mother, and in general Noxus's, it seems like, which would make him an interesting character to follow. Here Jinx is having the Shimmer put into her, quite possibly the same that was given to Viktor, and is likely under immense pain, and in this state her first thoughts are still with Vi. Though, as with the voices she hears, she remembers both the good and bad points. Vi telling her that she is stronger than she thinks in encouragement, but then she also sees how Caitlyn has replaced her. And this representing the fear of abandonment that, she's carried all of these episodes. And I feel like the state that she's in now, these emotions are just being exploded to 11. And so when you consider this, it makes a fun scene in this episode where she goes after Caitlyn understandable. With everything she's just been through, all of these emotions running high, this is what Jinx would do. This is her trying to protect what's important to her. In this scene, Jayce meets Mel's mum. And we'll talk more about this scene later, but I really wanted to talk about the reason for Mel's mother coming into the show now of all times. She doesn't really have a big role to play in Season 1 of Arcane. I would argue that her purpose for this episode is to set up Jayce to tell the council that they need to do something, to give him that push in that direction. Which is fine, but if that's all they needed this character for, then they could have used an already existing character to do the same thing. I think it's pretty clear that this is the setup for Season 2, where Mel will become a more important character and where her mother here will be our gateway into learning more about Noxus and be introduced to more characters from there. We've already been dropped hints about Mel's brother crossing a man that shouldn't be crossed, and of likely war coming. And Arcane has shown that it doesn't like to waste characters. If Mel's mother is introduced here, then you can bet she will come up again later. Heck, if this is Arcane, I go as far to say that her bodyguard here will get his own flashback by the end of the series. When Jayce asks about who makes these, Caitlyn hesitates, conflicted between her loyalty to Vi and to Jayce. But seeing this, Vi immediately tells the council that it was Jinx. I think in part this action is due to her feelings for Caitlyn and how close the two have become, but it also says something about her character. Vi was never one to be shrewd or lie. She has always worn her emotions on her sleeve and just been a very straightforward character with what she wants. But considering this is her sister, I feel that this decision was in part made by seeing everyone Jinx killed on the bridge. She doesn't want any more killing to happen, and if anything, her best chance of getting to Jinx is this. And I feel like her decision here represents that scene on the bridge in the last episode a bit more, where she leaves without really saying a word to Jinx, where it really does feel like, taking this scene into account, that she doesn't recognise her sister anymore. She can't believe what Jinx has done. She's heartbroken over the fact that Jinx has killed all of these people. In this scene, Viktor is running on a new leg, the music raising and reflecting his emotions. The first experiment has worked, however, he has no more shimmer left. And Heimerdinger warned that magic is dangerous, that they're playing with fire. And we see the ramifications here as Viktor recklessly tries to go through another transformation quickly without obtaining more shimmer. And his assistant tries to save him and is killed in the process. And as she does this, I feel like the emotions on Viktor's face here is saying, why are you trying to stop me? But then he turns to horror as she's killed by the magic. And in this moment, I think he really realizes that he has been playing with fire. He realizes what he's done, just how much he's been caught up in this and how much he's lost sight of why he started all this for. And the hexcore now more closely resembles that of the vision that Viktor has been seeing. And I think this is, again, more build up for Season 2, more build up for when we see more ramifications for this magic. Because I don't think all of this setup earlier in Arcane with Heimerdinger saying, you know, you must destroy this and you don't know what you're dealing with, and these visions that Viktor has been seeing, I don't think the climax for all of that is this scene. I think we're definitely going to get more to do with this hexcore, more ramifications to do with magic, but that will likely be in Season 2. In this scene, Jayce is in the Forge again, showing us that he is stressed. And Vi turns up here and convinces him that he needs to act. What I want to talk about in the scene are the gloves. As mentioned before, Chekhov's gun, stating that if something is shown, it will be used. And these gloves were shown many episodes ago. And also as a little treat for anyone who plays the games, Vi uses similar gloves in the game. People who played those games likely knew that this was going to happen at some point. This is a type of reward in writing that I see a lot. Basically, when the reader knows something is going to happen, for example, there's a prophecy that the hero will wield a magic sword, but as the story begins, the hero has no idea where to find this sword. We know it will happen at some point in the story, and it will be satisfying and rewarding when it does. Things like this in writing often happen because if they don't, they disappoint the reader, and it becomes unsatisfying to the reader. Just imagine that the hero has been thinking about this magic sword, all the story, and then one of his companions wields it instead. Wouldn't be quite that satisfying, would it? The hero has just gone through all of this journey, believing that he will, one day be worthy of this sword, and then he has to watch as his friend, wields it instead. Would not be satisfying. This is not a concrete rule. In general, it's kind of there to make sure the reader feels satisfied from this. But going back to that example that I gave, I could imagine that story, if it feels unsatisfying to us as the reader because the hero's friend got to wield the sword, I could imagine in that story the hero slowly turning into the villain in a way because he's matching our emotions. He's matching our level of unsatisfaction because it's an injustice that has happened to him in a way. So again, not the concrete rule, but it does happen to keep reader satisfaction, especially if the story is not going to go to those extra lengths to justify why it doesn't happen. But back to Arcane, yes. Vi wearing these gauntlets, I think, was an inevitability in this first season. And not just because she's shown wearing them in the opening, but because of Vander and her being, in a way, like Vander's legacy. And Vander wearing these gloves, and now it kind of almost coming full circle, and now she's wearing the gloves and kind of almost taking up Vander's mantle. In this scene, I'm a little surprised that Jayce is not wearing armor. And this is what I mentioned in the last episode, where I thought it would have been far-fetched to see Jayce, a scientist with no combat training, and we have to assume that he has none because Arcane has not shown us that he does, fight back these shimmer-infused soldiers. I still think, even now, that it's a little far-fetched that he's not wearing armor, though I do think armor was a consideration of the writers in this scene. They would have had this dilemma here. If they give Jayce armor, they would need to introduce the armor earlier along with the gauntlets, along with any functionality that it might have, and then incorporate all of that into the fight scene here. That may not seem bad, but currently there isn't much to keep track of. Vi's punches punch hard, and Jayce's hammer, as we can see, can create a defense shield and shoot energy blasts. However, add armor into all of this, and suddenly it becomes a bit too much to keep track of. Comparing it to a game tutorial, having armor would be like giving you all the moves before it's taught you the basics. Compare this to what they've done in the show, which is not to have any armor. It makes the scene a little far-fetched, but overall makes the action a lot more understandable and watchable as a result. We know roughly what Jayce's limits are. We know he can be killed easily, which adds tension, whereas the armor would likely have made him into a sort of god in this battle. Still, a little surprised he didn't wear any enforcer armor here. Even a vest to prevent bullets would have been something. And I think it's easy to forget that Jayce doesn't have much experience leading. He is considered the head of the council because of his scientific achievements, but he doesn't have much experience in warfare, and the weight of all of Piltover weighing on him as he desperately tries his best. And other than Mel, no one in the council really has experience either, making it all but impossible for Jayce to base his leadership off of someone. And this lack of experience is shown throughout the episode, first with Mel's mother convincing him that he needs to act, this coming through in the council scene, and then with Vi who convinces him to attack the factory. And this battle is a great amalgamation of this. Here we can rehear Mel's words. Jayce does not know war. He has had no training. The first time he saw death, he puked. And his face reflects that naivete here. He's panicked, full of adrenaline, rampantly shooting to protect himself in a fight or flight situation. And the result is he hits a kid. Caitlyn and Vi have been built up throughout Act 2 of Arcane, the show highlighting on multiple occasions the differences between the two. In fact, it uses this as a way of showing the two getting closer and how their mindset on the other has changed. And in this scene, notice how they're laying. It kind of looks like the yin-yang sign, both at different ends but in the same position, representing the differences between them that we have seen throughout Act 2, and showing how similar but different the two are. And this comes to fruition in the council scene, where Caitlyn holds back information out of concern of Vi. I think this shows a milestone in how much she cares for Vi, but in a way that highlights their differences in a negative light. Caitlyn has always been upstanding, wanted to prove that she is not just a councillor's daughter. She fights against corruption, and these ideals are shown strongly in her in Act 2. However, in this scene, though out of concern for Vi, she breaks these ideals. she actively shows Vi that she cannot be who she is if she wants to be with her. It's after these events with the council that Vi calls them oil and water, but I feel the act of Caitlyn going against her ideals highlights the scene more than the council just not agreeing with Vi. And as this episode ends, we see Caitlyn thinking about Vi's words, oil and water. But Caitlyn has never been one to do as others say. And I think the music reflects this, as she's trying to rack her brain for a way to either change Vi's mind or to make them compatible, to make oil and water mix. And as her blood drops into the water here, I believe this appears to symbolise that if they can't be oil and water, then blood and water will do. They don't have to be similar, they just have to be able to mix. And here is the character map for episode 8. Now, I think something which is going to stick out pretty much straight away is Mel has more links now. I put her brother in there, even though he was only mentioned that he's dead, because I feel like he affects who Mel is. His ideals of war being a failure of statecraft, I believe, are held within Mel, and this is something that defines her character. So I've put her in there. I've put her mother in there as well, and another link to Jayce, from Jayce to her mother, for that one scene. The Chem Barons as well. We also saw Finn approaching Sevika in this episode, so I've added another bit there, and we'll see a bit more links in the next episode as well coming from them. But overall in this episode, we just see more and more links coming from one character to another, more links coming from Piltover characters to Undercity characters. And we can see this here with Vi. Vi now has a link to Jayce, because we've seen Vi work with Jayce. We've seen Vi affect Jayce's decision. We now have a link from Heimerdinger to Ekko as well, because Heimerdinger meets Ekko under the bridge. I didn't talk about it in the episode because I feel like there will be more to talk about it in the next episode, but Heimerdinger meets Ekko in this episode as well. Miss Young unfortunately also dies, which I feel like almost represents Viktor's mindset in this scene. When we look at Viktor's links, he hasn't gained any new links in this episode. He has been alone. He has this sense of solitude in this episode where he doesn't feel like he can trust anyone else. He's relying completely on himself and the magic to get what he wants. And we can kind of see his links here. He's an assistant to Heimerdinger. He was saved by Jayce and has Miss Young and has Singed as a friend. He's actually got and I guess kind of Rio as well, even though Rio is basically half dead at this point. But we can see he has kind of not too many links, and he doesn't really interact with any of these links all that often. And I feel, again, this is kind of like an indicator of what's been happening to him. And his one link here, who doesn't really link into anyone else but Jayce, has basically been killed off, and this is going to affect him. And we'll see more about that in the next episode. I also have another link from Singed to Jinx here, that Singed has basically saved her life, and that he got the scars in his face from Jinx, or at least it's what we believe happened. Yeah, and overall, we can kind of see from this diagram that the outliers are slowly becoming more rounded out in this episode. We're seeing more links from those outliers as they're kind of formed more into a circle in this diagram. And we can really see the chaotic nature of this diagram, how all the different characters are interacting with all the different characters. And I feel like this is really going to show something when we compare this to how Arcane started off, or even how it started off in Act 2 compared to the diagram for the final episode. But I'll leave that discussion for the next episode. Well, this has been my analysis of episode 8 of Arcane. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave any comments below. And if you've made it this far and you've not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. Feel free to give me a like, just so you know when the next episode is going to come out. This has been That Stephen Rich. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the finale. Episode 9 of Arcane is one of the only episodes in the series to not start with a flashback of some kind. The only other exceptions have been episode 4, which was the first episode after a time skip, and episode 7, which had that quick music video that still kind of relates to Ekko. And the reason for this is simple. One is that it is the final part of Act 3, and the end of Season 1. The time for getting to know these characters has come and gone. Now we want to see what they do and how they change. And pacing. Everything has started to ramp up since the end of the last episode. With the factory fight and Jinx kidnapping Caitlyn, a flashback would have killed this pacing. And finally, the child. At the end of the last episode, Jayce accidentally kills a child. And this is something this episode wants to emphasize here. The episode starting on his dead face, reminding us of what has happened and trying to emulate to us what Jayce is going through right at that moment. And I mentioned before, the first scene of an episode can be one of the most memorable ones. From this point on, whenever Jayce makes a decision or does an action, we will think back to this scene and be reminded of why he is doing what he is doing. The boy that was killed turns out to be the son of one of the Chem Barons, Rennie. At the beginning of this series, the characters and events of Piltover had almost nothing to do with the Undercity. But now, every move by one person has an effect on another. Jayce mourned over not knowing what to do with the boy or whose family he belongs to, and we get to see his family in the very next scene. And due to his actions, he turns the Chem Baron Rennie against Silco, and further adds fuel to Finn's fire. And I love how Arcane leaves nothing unused. The Chem Barons were introduced in this final arc, and their role seemingly confined to Silco, to show us the effect Piltover is having on the people of the Undercity, and showing how they are taking Silco's current rule. But here they have branched out past Silco. And in this scene, it's interesting how the focus goes from Silco to Finn, even though he's talking to Rennie, almost as if there is a deeper meaning behind his words. Silco knows Finn is there and watching, and knows Finn has issues with the way he runs things. It's pretty clear that these words are meant for Finn in this scene. And finally, Sevika's lingering stare at Finn, whose expression says, "You know I'm right." All set up for later. Viktor is holding his assistant's glasses here, flashes of the nightmare coming back to him. He looks at the hexcore and realizes that it is too dangerous. And like Heimerdinger said, it should be destroyed. And I feel that the rumbling noises it makes here in this scene become almost like a silent back and forth between it and Viktor. The core has become almost like a drug for Viktor. Viktor knows he still needs it, and that he can go back to the high he has been on and finding a way to cure himself. And this can be very much like any kind of addiction we may have, where we may want to stop but end up going back. But I feel what is more frightening is how it feels like the core is protecting itself, reacting to Viktor's actions, and even displaying power over the changed parts of his body. Viktor also seems to use a cane later in the episode, so it could either be the trauma on his body that's stopping him from using his leg like he did to run on the dock, or it could be the hexcore itself removing that ability from him. This scene shows how everything is linked in Arcane, and how every action has consequences that affect others, and how the world outside our characters feels alive, reacting to the actions our characters are making. Mel's mother spoke with Jayce in the last episode in order to make him take action. She wants Piltover to go to war with the Undercity, because if they do, they will make weapons, and she wants those weapons. I mentioned this in the last episode, but her part to play in all this could have just as easily been done by an existing character. But it's amazing how Arcane goes to the extra lengths to bring in these additional characters and then ask why. Why are they doing this? Why is she trying to convince Jayce to attack the Undercity? All at the same time giving these characters links to existing characters to really make them feel a part of this world, that there are other things in this world moving all at the same time as independently from what our characters are doing. Viktor is back in the place that is important to him, the place where Heimerdinger found him and his life changed. We saw him in this place in a previous episode when he was struggling with his own mortality. And now he is back here again, mourning over his assistant and spreading her ashes. And I love how this is the place where things turn around for Viktor again. He is about to end his own life, but Jayce saves him, returning the favour that of when Viktor saved him from killing himself. But it's more than this. It was an act of friendship that changed Jayce, and in turn allowed them both to change their lives. It was an act of friendship that was Heimerdinger taking on Viktor as his assistant. Viktor has been alone these last few episodes, as has Jayce in a way, and I think the act of him turning up in this place is meant to change this. The timing of the appearance would also make you know that this means something, along with the roles being reversed from years ago. To Viktor, this would be like a sign that things will get better, and that, like with Jayce, the two need to trust each other once again and remind themselves of why they started it all to begin with. Sevika, Finn and Rennie come in, and Sevika pulls out the chair and pats it down for Finn, a clear show that power has changed. Silco doesn't know whose side Sevika is on, and knowing these could be his last words, he speaks of loyalty, something which resonates with Sevika, having saved her when she sacrificed her arm to protect him. Silco went that extra length to go and make sure she had a functioning arm that can work, that can let her live, and not just only do her job, but live her life. But I think the real reason he speaks of loyalty is Vander, who was brought up in the conversation. Silco was loyal to Vander, and Vander betrayed him. And I love how shocked he looks after Sevika swings, clearly not knowing whether he was going to live or die. And Finn drops to the ground. The lighter that seems to symbolize him, a new flame being brought in, is dropped to the ground, showing that this is his end. And something I missed on my first viewing was the letter from Jayce asking for a meeting here. I mentioned this in the very first video I did on Arcane, that I found it a little far-fetched that neither of them have any guards in this scene. But now that I think deeper on this, I don't think it was too far-fetched. Jayce has been through a lot and desperately wants to correct things. He went to this meeting and probably stated so in the letter that he would be weaponless and alone. I think he was willing to die here if it came down to it, but also knew that trust is important. He and Viktor lost that trust in one another and started to drift apart because of it. So knowing this, Jayce is now extending that trust to Silco. And by trust here, I don't mean trust as in like a friendship kind of trust, but a trust in that both of them can get along and make something work out. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Silco has Sevika and some of his men hiding somewhere close by, just in case, but considering Jayce would have wanted to deal, it's not unreasonable to assume that he would play nice until he noticed something was up. We've experienced what the Undercity is like when enforcers are breathing down their necks, and how the Chem Barons are seeing this. This deal is perhaps just as important to Silco as it is for Jayce. We can also see that the area is open and clear as well, which would have allowed his men to search in case enforcers were hiding somewhere. And I love this shot here of the two, both standing by a rising sun, one with their back to the screen and one with their front to the screen. Jayce is willing to give Silco everything he wants as long as he stops Shimmer production, hands back the gemstone, and gives him Jinx. And you can see that Silco keeps his composure just until Jayce moves past him, the final shot one of his back showing how dejected he is feeling. He's been given everything he's ever wanted, but he's definitely not feeling excited about it. And leading on to the next scene, we can see the same writing trick used here that they did in episode 4. We're reminded of Jinx, which also reminds us of what she did at the end of the last episode. This would have been a good time to switch scenes to her, but instead we get Ekko, who fought Jinx last, starting to give us little bits of information to build up her eventual return. Is Jinx the same as the one we knew? How has she changed? At the end of the last episode, Singe warned us that she wouldn't be the same person, and we don't know what she's like now. And Arcane dangles these questions in front of us, knowing that we want the answers, and purposefully doesn't give them to us straight, instead just giving us hints as the episode goes on, to build up that anticipation of ours. In this scene, Ekko tells Heimerdinger that it's not enough to give the people what they need to survive. You need to give them what they need to live. And I believe this statement parallels Jinx's position. Silco has given her what she needs to survive, but not necessarily what she needs to live. Vi is what Jinx needs to live. Her person and her family. Silco may be the father figure to her now, but he can't replace Vi. And in this scene, Silco talks to Vander. And I think just how Jace and Viktor were able to repair their friendship and understand one another again, in this moment Silco is able to understand Vander better. Silco has been presented with his vision, but he is questioning what he wants, and this shocks him. because once upon a time, he could never see anything as being more important. Once upon a time, he was literally filled with anger and hatred at Vander, unable to understand why Vander tried to kill him that day. But now, Silco understands. For all Silco hated Vander, he has effectively become Vander now. And the way he talks to him in the scene is like that of a brother, much like the scene with Jace and Viktor from earlier, and he even shares a drink with him. And I think if Vander, Clagger and Milo were alive now, Vander and Silco would probably see eye to eye. And finally we see Jinx overhearing the conversation, and much like in Act 1 of Arcane, what Jinx overhears is not what is actually meant. Again, it's like the beginning of a tragedy in motion. From all the way from the mistake that started the inciting incident to now in this final episode. Vi's rematch with Sevika appears to be far more emotional this time, for a number of reasons. One is that Sevika almost killed her the last time they fought. Vi is likely not only fighting Sevika, but also the memories of being stabbed by her. But mostly it is how she is alone. The council were unable to help her, and even Jayce left her after the battle in the factory. Vi could have gone to the Firelights for help, but this has never been her way. She has always been one to rush in there and turn to violence first. She tried, this attack being her last hope to defeat Silco, avenge her family, and get back her sister. And Arcane really shows this in these scenes. And before we get to the final scene, I wanted to point out in this one that Jayce calls Viktor a Zaunite. In this scene, you can tell that Jace's heart feels clear. He's no longer trying to become someone that he is not, and even calls Viktor his partner and a Zaunite, already accepting in his head that the nation of Zaun is a thing, and perhaps always has been. And finally, we get to the tea party.
Really thought I buried this place. But I should have known better. Nothing ever stays dead.
Jinx is talking about her negative thoughts and fears. She's tried to bury it and move away from it, but it keeps coming back to haunt her. And so she is back at the factory, where it all started, where Jinx was born, as a final way of deciding who she should be. I think firstly we see just how much the change has affected Jinx. She doesn't appear to be shimmered up, but she seems to have all the heightened abilities that come with it, shown by not only her being able to capture Caitlyn and Vi and Silco, but also how she flicks the lighter across the table, lighting all the candles. And across the table is everyone that has meant something to Jinx, including the dolls she made of Milo and Clagger. Even the bunny representing Vi is there, and Vander's gauntlet and pipe. Most importantly is the positioning of Vi and Silco, both at different ends of the table to represent the two different families Jinx has and the different sides they are on. Jinx feels like she has lost even Silco now, that everyone has betrayed her, but out of everyone, Vi is still her sister and someone she loves, despite being betrayed, and that is why she is the only one who is not gagged. At this moment, Jinx wants to hear what she has to say. She asked if they are sisters, which is a strain of compulsive thoughts brought about by her seeing Vi with Caitlyn when she was under stress. She feels that she will be replaced with Caitlyn. And now that she's overheard Silco and doesn't trust him anymore, she has brought him as an offering to Vi. And you can see in this scene how she is standing next to Vi, clearly on one side of the table. She wants Vi to pick her. And in this part, she brings out the tray, making us think that Caitlyn's head is on there. I feel that this is kind of like a threat. Jinx doesn't outright say it, but she wants Caitlyn gone, and there is no compromise in that. But rather than just saying that, she makes Vi believe that if Caitlyn is around, her safety will be in danger. And I should also point out here that we're not exactly sure what effect the shimmer has had on Jinx, but I feel that as well as making her ability stronger, it has also made her mental illnesses stronger as well. The first thing Jinx did after she was healed was kidnap Caitlyn. But she also appears to be more on edge, actually reacting to these issues now, like shooting Milo's doll as opposed to just shouting back at the voices. And just a small note here, but in this time she has also fixed the damage to Jace's gauntlets, using both of them to bring in the cupcake. A nice little taunt here is Vi would often call Caitlyn Cupcake, and where she made us think that Caitlyn's head was inside this tray, it was actually a cupcake.
You gonna help me out, Cupcake?
It could go away. Please.
When Jinx gives Vi the choice to get rid of Caitlyn, her voice changes. She was Jinx before, exuding the confidence and snarky tone, but here I feel she is more towards Powder. Her voice more nervous, afraid of being abandoned, and knowing that Vi may choose not to shoot Caitlyn and effectively abandon her again. This is a trauma to Jinx, and she is terrified of that. And now when Silco tells her that he would give up everything for her, it puts her into disarray. These are the words she's always wanted to hear. Silco is willing to do what Vi is not. And I think Jinx believes him here. The problem is that deep down she really wanted to hear this from Vi and not from Silco. And when Caitlyn attempts to shoot Jinx, Jinx could have killed her. In fact, Jinx had ample chance to kill Caitlyn, but she knows that if she did, Vi would hate her for it, and she would lose Vi. And I believe that she wants Vi to choose her over Caitlyn. Else Jinx could have killed Caitlyn in her house and made it look like an accident. When Vi tells Jinx to picture everyone here, they don't appear as welcoming guests in her mind, but as monsters. Vi doesn't realise that these are the demons that haunt her. These are the people she has killed. They are negative experiences to Jinx, and this has sent her into a full-blown panic. And as Silco tries to shoot Vi, the one he believes causing Jinx this pain, Jinx acts. On my first watch, I thought this was a response to Silco's actions here, and that still might be true to an extent, but it actually looks like she was shooting all around the room, kind of like she did on the airship in episode 4. I think she was trying to shoot the monsters away, unaware or perhaps only slightly aware of what was actually happening around her. And something else that could point towards her actions being from Silco aiming at Vi is what Vi used to do when they were kids. She used to get carried away and scare Powder sometimes, and then would scare the monsters away, telling Powder that no monster's going to get you while I'm here. This could have been something that Powder was subconsciously thinking about whilst the monsters were attacking her. And so when Silco pointed the gun at Vi, at least some part of her knew that Vi couldn't go away because then the monsters might get her. And in Silco's final moments, he affirms that Jinx is perfect just the way she is, validating her. In his last moments, he wanted to make sure that Jinx was okay, not wanting her to carry the guilt of this act. And so Jinx sits in her chair. Jinx knows that Powder is dead. She has changed and doesn't want to go back to the way she was before. But Vi is trying to make her do this. She wants Powder back and not Jinx. And Jinx knows this. But Vi is her sister, her person. And as humans, I believe that, especially in Jinx's case, we would do everything we could to hang on to that person. But Jinx has decided she is beyond saving now. She is everything people have been saying about her. And she is no longer Powder and no longer able to become Powder or even attempt to. And now that Silco can't do it himself, Jinx is going to make everyone pay. Episode 9 has a real theme of family. Rennie's child was killed. Viktor grieves over Skye, his assistant. Mel rejects her family, taking off her ring in the council chamber and tarnishing her painting. Viktor and Jayce make up. Silco understands Vander, and pretty much everything in the final scene of this episode. And surprisingly, I think this theme is really highlighted with Mel. We can see that before she was trying to put Piltover on the map. And I think what we can really determine from this is that she was clinging on to her family. That she wanted to be accepted by her family. At least a part of her does. And so she still clings to it. And this is much like how Powder still clings to Vi. And at the end of the episode, like how Jinx finally stops clinging to Vi, Mel also stops clinging to her family. This episode really emphasizes the bonds of family and how those bonds define our characters and actions and affect them. Even right from the very first scene of episode 1, Vander chooses to become Vi and Powder's new family, his family changing him and his priorities as a person. It's been the driving force for Jinx along with what's been affecting her all this time. And even Silco has slowly changed because of it. We've seen the good and the bad of what it has to offer, but most importantly, this episode has displayed the power it has over our characters very clearly. One of the things I think that stands out the most in Arcane is its characters. When it comes to writing magic in stories, I believe that weaknesses and limitations that are put on the magic are often more interesting than the magic itself. Look at Superman as an example. If you ask someone to tell you one thing about Superman, you can all but guarantee that they're going to tell you that his weakness is kryptonite over something like, oh, he can shoot lasers from his eyes or fly or something like that. And I believe this concept translates over to characters as well. Jinx is the prime example of this. She's a badass, battle-hardened, and also a genius inventor, but it's not these aspects of her that make her character interesting. It is the voices she hears, the abandonment issues, the jealousy she feels when she sees Vi and Caitlyn together. Same thing with Silco. If he were unchanging in his vision in making the nation of Zaun, he would not be as interesting. But it's his love for Jinx and the struggle within him that makes him more interesting as a character. And if you look over the characters of Arcane, you can see these aspects in all of them. Even the very minor characters like Huck, who in all timelines, I should not remember. But the fact that he helped Caitlyn and then sells her out because of his addiction shows me a real and interesting struggle in a person. And this attention to detail is shown all throughout the series, from the micro expressions on characters' faces, to the drawings on Silco's ashtray, to the little bits of dialogue that are meant to fill in any potential plot holes. You can tell that this story was lovingly created, with every character being treated with the respect they deserve. After looking at a lot of comments about this opening scene, in order to reevaluate this section, I felt it best just to show you a comment by The Story of Us. And I believe their comment has the perfect evaluation of this opening. It reads, something I would like to talk about a bit is with regards to Ekko's equivalent of a flashback scene in this episode. Notice, of course, that it is not like a scene at all, it's practically a music video. So I think that really the best way to look at it is through that lens, asking yourself what it may be trying to convey. The rap hip-hop genre it uses to evoke these anti-authority themes, framing them as revolutionaries or resistance fighters. The art style like graffiti, again harkening the rebellious attitudes. Listen to the lyrics that are direct and aggressive, that speak to the toughness and marginalized and pour against corrupt officials and street violence, framing the Firelight's place in this world. What I think all this points to is something that speaks to Ekko's character in a unique way, is that he thinks differently to a lot of other characters, in that his group identity supersedes his individual identity. For Ekko, as we then introduce him, he has a very us and them worldview. These attitudes that are presented here is the group attitudes of the Firelights, assigned to them by their collective use of masks that hide their individual identities but ties them together as a collective identity. And sure enough, his first scene is an interrogation of Vi to determine where her allegiances lie. He's trying to suss out if she is either with the Enforcers, Silco, or with him, and only the latter means she isn't his enemy. He doesn't treat her like an old friend at all. And what I believe this sets up is his arc for the rest of the series. It begins with the establishment of this narrow group identity where association with a collective determines who they are. We see him denounce Powder as dead due to her association with Silco, attacking Vi on sight due to her seeming association with the Enforcers, with him being softened after Vi shows him she's not his enemy despite his hostilities. Then his friendship with Vi eases him into a careful alliance with Caitlyn, an Enforcer who shows him understanding and sympathy. Then later on the bridge, when he has Jinx in a vice, he's overcome upon seeing his old friend again, realizing that despite his pontifications about her being dead due to her voluntary association with Silco, that she's right there in front of him now, a realization that causes him to cease his violence against her. Next we see him befriend Heimendinger after relating to his experiences with the people of the Undercity and invites him to their hideout. And so we see this process of Ekko letting go of generalized assumptions of who is good and who is bad based on tribalistic sentiment and past experiences. Something that allows him to let go of a lot of angry coping behaviors for his feelings of dejection as a poor person from the Undercity. So I think the intro to this episode does the same job as the flashbacks for each character. It introduces the themes of their storylines, and this one does too for Ekko in a fitting and unique way, given its context. It tells us, without spoiling anything, who the Firelights are, and so by extension tells us who Ekko is now. So thank you very much, Story of Us, for this very insightful evaluation of this opening scene and Ekko as a character. And I guess, finally, Jinx. If I had to pick someone to be the main character of this series, it would be her. In a way, this whole season has been about her transformation from Powder to Jinx. She was the one who created the inciting incident in episode 1, starting everything off. She has been the motive for so many characters, and she has been the one who ends it in Arcane's final scene. And that's why this final scene is not a fight in the traditional sense, but a battle for what will become of her character. For the writers, I can only imagine how monumentous of a task this would have been. How dangerous it could have been if we as the viewers didn't accept some of the things happening to her, some of the things she suffered from, or some of the actions because of it. But the writers aced it. And who knows, maybe one of these days, school teaches about Arcane rather than Shakespeare. And now, the character map for one last time. As this is the final episode of Arcane, I thought it only fitting that we start from the character map from episode 1. I'm not going to go through all the details like I did before, but just to kind of show the changes as we go. And you can see from the character map in episode 1, the scope was very limited. The characters introduced very limited, with just 2 of the characters being from Piltover, most of which being from the Undercity. And if we look at episode 2, the character map has expanded significantly, with Jayce and many of the characters from Piltover being introduced in this episode, as well as more links between Piltover and the Undercity being created, but there's still being this divider between them, this divider between Piltover and the Undercity. And episode 3 showed a lot of changes, a lot of death of characters, and a lot of links being created. Arcane's a little unique in the way that episode 1, 2, and 3 is kind of like its own story. It is the prologue for the main series, in a way. And that's why for episode 4, I started off small again, showing just the characters introduced in that episode, showing that most of the episode here is revolving around Jayce and Jinx, Piltover and the Undercity. And as we go to episode 5, we can see more and more links being brought back in, more characters being introduced and created. But at the same time, there's still being a kind of separation between top and bottom, between Piltover and the Undercity, where only a few characters from the Undercity are linking into Piltover. The story is developing, we can definitely tell that by the number of links that have been created. But the actions of these characters are being localized to Piltover and to the Undercity, with only a few outliers there. And then for episode 6, you can see how more of the outer characters like Viktor are being introduced and given detail on and becoming more rounded in the story as a whole. Also with our main characters having depth added to them and being given more links all around. And I feel here from episode 7 is where things start to leap out almost. We get a few more links between Caitlyn and Ekko here. We get some more minor links from Piltover to Zaun, with some more minor character introductions being created as well. And I think this is the episode where we really start to see how actions of one really start to affect others, where now there looks like there is no separation between Piltover and the Undercity, where there are links going from characters from one to the other all over, where even characters on the outer sides, like the Chem Barons and Mel, are becoming a little more well-rounded out and a little more fleshed out in the story. And finally, episode 9. We can definitely see here that there is almost no discernible difference between Piltover and the Undercity here. Actions are affecting everyone, like Jayce's actions to raid the factory. The character maps at this point have almost been like the war being waged between Piltover and the Undercity, where at first they are separated, only minor instances and occurrences happening, but now it's almost like a full-fledged war happening to them, where actions and relations between these characters are growing and changing all over the place. And you can see on this character map just which characters have had the most effect on the story as a whole. Jayce with all of his links here, Jinx with all of her links, Vi with all of her links, and Silco with all of his links. These 4 have been definitely the key main characters in this series. And with slightly less main characters, we have characters like Caitlyn, who have a lot of links to her. And as I've mentioned throughout this entire series, I think this graph really just shows you how Arcane does not let any character go unused. There are almost no characters on this map that are by themselves, almost no characters that just have a single link to their name. Every character in this story has had multiple purposes, has had multiple reasons for being there, has had their stories and backstories and personalities fleshed out. I hope everyone has enjoyed the analysis of episode 9, the finale of Arcane. I love this show so much, and I really cannot wait for a season 2. The original 9 parts of this was quite the undertaking, and it's inevitable when you take on something like this that you're going to miss things out. But with the help of many of you in the comments, I was able to add extra parts to this video that weren't in the originals, and I'd like to give everyone that commented a big thank you for that. But as always, there are bound to be even more things that I've missed out, so feel free to comment everything in the comments down below. Well, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please consider hitting that subscribe button so you can be aware of whatever I might tackle next, or stay up to date on the book I'm currently writing, of the first chapter of which you can see in the link below. Well, again, thank you very much for watching. This has been That's Effin' Rich, and I'll see you on the next one.